So welcome this morning to the first series of workshops at SAM 21. So I'm really excited to welcome you to SAM. Maybe this is your first session. I was thinking back about attending SAM. The first time I went was actually 15 years ago when I got to go to San Francisco as first year resident. And so this is quite different from then, but I really am excited to be here today. SAM has helped, I know me in my career to maintain or to make and maintain a lot of connections. And I hope that this session today inspires you and helps motivate you and gives you some connections to those who are attending. So I'm really proud to be presenting with the other speakers today, a really awesome group of people here. So I'm Elisa Hayes, and our other presenters today are Mary Beth Phelan and Claire Becker, who are both here at Medical College of Wisconsin, and then Jeff Stone, who is joining us from University of Arizona. So we'll go through just a little bit of logistics. I'll introduce everyone more in depth, and then we'll get started with the session. So let's see here. All right, so as you all have probably experienced, there are some limitations to being in the virtual platform, but there are also some benefits, which is nice, especially when you're talking about a topic such as this, because sometimes people are a little more able to join in on a conversation like this when you're not directly in the room with someone. So we'll work with our limited functionality. We encourage you to use the chat function throughout the sessions to enter questions as they come up. We will be taking pauses to answer those questions, but feel free to put them in at any time as we move through the presentations and the small group activities. If you have like tech problems or just questions about what's coming up in the sessions or things like that, feel free to use the chat function for that as well. And I've provided both the phone numbers and email addresses for myself and Dr. Phelan there. So you can feel free to use those. We have some great MSAs on the call with us today. If you all want to say hello and introduce yourselves too, this might be a nice time to do that. And I think they'll help facilitate if you all have questions too.
Totally. Hi, I'm Anna. I'm an MS3 at the Icahn School of Medicine at Mount Sinai.
Hi everyone, I'm Jeanette, and I go to Touro University, Nevada.
If any of you have any IT problems or questions that you don't want to direct to the panelists, feel free to reach out to us. We've labeled our names with MSA so you can chat us directly.
Thank you.
Excellent. And then Monica is here too. She's our moderator for the day. So also if we need any assistance with that, you can reach out to Monica to help as well. Do you want to introduce yourself too?
Hi all, I'm Monica Saxena. Same thing. If you have any questions during the presentation, just shoot me a message in the chat.
Perfect. And you can feel free to, have your cameras on or off. We understand, this is a long workshop and you may not want to have your cameras on the whole time, but there will be portions where we'll be, doing small group sessions and things like that. So it might, be more interactive if you plan to be at your cameras at those times. But we understand, that likely you'll be hopping on and off throughout the day as well, and feel free to do that. We have different sessions or different activities planned throughout the morning and early afternoon. So if you're not able to stay for the whole time but can come and go, we welcome that as well. So at the end, we'll also be providing some time for networking. I know that for myself, at least, that going to these workshops, one of the things I enjoy the most about it is getting to meet the other people at the workshop. So we hope that, we are all people with some similar interests here, And at the end of the workshop, we will invite you to make contact with any of the presenters if you would like, and, just make connections with each other. So feel free, to unmute and speak up if you'd like, put questions in the chat, and just stay engaged with us throughout the morning. So I'll just share a little bit about what we kind of saw as the vision for this workshop. We wanted to move beyond making statements and just explaining basic definitions. And we wanted to really move into this space of giving you something that you can take back to your own institution, take back to your own group, and use on a day-to-day basis. So we have a broad range of presenters here with a lot of varied expertise. So hopefully you'll find something new and different than what you have probably seen in other presentations on this similar topic. We're going to go deeper into the concept of stereotype threat and specifically look at microaggressions in academic emergency medicine, which is a very specific place for this to be happening. And then, as I mentioned, we hope to equip you with the tools to return to your institutions with next steps for being a leader, approaching leaders on this topic, and working with learners on this as well. So we have our panelists today who are comprised of 2 emergency medicine physicians, a professor of psychology, and a program manager and coach. So this might seem like an unlikely group of people to talk about this. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we came to be working together as a group on this workshop. So I originally started my career at University of Missouri, which was a place where I would walk in, down the hall of all the busts of, the 12 male deans who had been there, over the years. And in my clinical work, I began to have these experiences that I didn't really know what to call them, but essentially I began to experience microaggressions. And like I mentioned, began as a member of SAEM when I was a resident, and also felt I learned a lot from attending those conferences and also being a member of some of the interest groups like the Academy for Women in Academic Emergency Medicine. And in those spaces, I connected with other women who were having similar experiences of microaggressions at work. It began to interest me. I learned the word, I learned what they were called, and wanted to do something about it. So I participated in the SAM Lion's Den real world research proposal session back about 5 years ago. And after that was motivated to reach out for some help on my project. And that's where, when I met Dr. Stone. So he is actually at University of Arizona, where I did my undergrad. And so we talked a little bit about what it was, how jealous I was that he was in Tucson and I wasn't. But I just sent him an email, and I guess this is a lesson for other people. Don't be afraid to reach out and ask for help. He's been just really wonderful through this process. He's an experienced NIH funded researcher. He has done all kinds of collaborations with people in the healthcare field, and he's just been a great guy to work with. And this collaboration resulted in me getting a small grant to study gendered microaggressions just before I came to MCW. So I moved here in September of 2019, and that's when I met Dr. Phelan and Claire Becker. So Dr. Phelan is the Vice Chair of Faculty Development, who's been an amazing partner here. And Claire Becker was the program manager at the time when I first joined. So some things have changed since I first got here. There was a pandemic, and then Claire moved on to begin her own coaching business. But other things have stayed the same, and that's that microaggressions still are a problem. And I quickly realized after sharing my vision and research interests here at MCW that there was still some work to be done. And so we reconnected with Dr. Stone and put together this workshop and also and we'll be sharing our experience about how we've done work on microaggressions here at MCW. So I'll give you a little bit more information about each of us, and mainly this is so that if you would like to connect or contact one of us later, you'll know who maybe the best person would be to do that. So Dr. Jeff Stone is a distinguished university professor of psychology and psychiatry at the University of Arizona. Since 2012, Professor Stone and his colleagues have developed and tested workshops for reducing implicit bias in the domains of healthcare and higher education. The implicit bias workshops focus on helping audience members to understand the nature of intergroup bias, how it influences thought and behavior, and to develop skills to reduce implicit bias when observing or interacting with others. So over his 30+ year career, Professor Stone's research has investigated the basic psychological processes underlying prejudice and stereotype threat, the reduction of intergroup bias, and mechanisms of health attitude and behavior change. He has published dozens of peer-reviewed papers and book chapters that document the bias processes that contribute to group-based disparities in health, higher education, and sports. In addition to the courses he teaches in the Department of Psychology, Dr. Stone leads regular workshops in the health sciences at the University of Arizona about the role of implicit bias for patient care, and has led workshops for medical and nursing faculty at the University of Alabama, Birmingham, the Wisconsin Public Health Nursing Association, the American Association of Colleges of Nursing, and the Missouri Academy of Family Physicians. Dr. Stone has led workshops on implicit bias for academic audiences like the STEM department chairs at Lehigh University and the University of Arizona for the Deans of Students Office, the Department of Management and Information Systems, and the Eller College, multiple departments across the College of Sciences, and the Office of Student Transfer, and for Residence Life. So we're really happy to have him here today, working with the emergency medicine group here at SAU. And next I'll introduce Claire. Claire Becker is, as I mentioned, was a program manager here at MCW and is now a transition coach for her own business, Claire Becker Coaching. So Claire guides leaders and teams through transitions to increase their effectiveness, alignment, unity, and inclusion. Before launching her coaching practice, she spent a decade working in professional development across education, healthcare, and nonprofit settings, serving learners and leaders of all ages. Her experiences include leading as a bilingual educator, as adjunct faculty at the graduate level, and as a coach for teachers, professionals, and leaders. So in addition to offering one-on-one and group coaching experiences, Claire partners with organizations to design and facilitate on topics such as transformative leadership, vision setting, and team development, as well as white identity development, unconscious bias, and inclusion. Claire graduated from the University of Wisconsin-Madison with a Bachelor of Arts in Sociology and Spanish in 2010. And she then received a Master's of Urban Education degree from Cardinal Stritch University in 2012. Claire is an Associate Certified Coach accredited by the International Coaching Federation. So as you can see, a very valuable member of our team, and we're so glad to have her expertise here today. Our next co-presenter is Dr. Mary Beth Phelan, a professor of emergency medicine and the inaugural vice chair for faculty development and advancement for the Department of Emergency Medicine at the Medical College of Wisconsin. Dr. Phelan is also the chief of the Division of Emergency Medicine Ultrasound. Dr. Phelan's primary areas of interest and research have included point-of-care ultrasound education and operations, as well as training healthcare providers and developing screening processes to detect patients experiencing intimate partner violence. She has been a departmental leader for point-of-care ultrasound curriculum development for medical students, residents, and faculty, as well as building both departmental and hospital infrastructure to support point-of-care ultrasound use. Dr. Phelan has previously collaborated with experts at the Medical College of Wisconsin, as well as community stakeholders, to educate and support clinicians to identify patients impacted by intimate partner violence. Her scholarly work in these areas have been presented locally, regionally, and nationally, and she continues to investigate, publish, and disseminate scholarly work in both areas of focus. She's a graduate of the Medical College of Wisconsin. She completed her residency in emergency medicine at Northwestern University, followed by a fellowship in emergency ultrasound at the Medical College of Wisconsin. So we're really happy to have Dr. Phelan here today as an excellent example of leadership, and she'll share her experience here at MCW. And then I'll be the last presenter today. I'm originally from Kansas City, Missouri. Like I mentioned, completed my Bachelor of Science in Microbiology at University of Arizona in Tucson. I returned to Missouri for medical school at the University of Missouri in Columbia and did my residency training at Barnes-Jewish Hospital, Washington University in St. Louis, where I served as chief resident. So after residency, I returned to Columbia, Missouri, where I was a faculty member in the Department of EM for more than 10 years. And during that time became the first woman promoted to associate professor in my department. I became highly involved in education and training and was instrumental in beginning the emergency medicine residency there as associate program director and was responsible for designing the resident didactic curriculum. I've also worked extensively with medical students as the medical student education director. I have worked as an advocate for women in medicine and chaired the MU Women in Medicine and Medical Sciences Executive Council, as well as the MU Women in Emergency Medicine group, which I founded. In 2018, I was awarded the SAM Academy for Women in Academic Emergency Medicine Hidden Gem Award for my efforts. So I completed a Master's of Science in Academic Medicine, as well as an intensive grant writing course. My research focuses on implicit bias and its effects on physician stress, career, and professional identity formation. And in 2019, I moved here to Medical College of Wisconsin, where I became the Vice Chair of Education and Training, and also currently serve as the Residency Program Director. So I'm really excited to be here today. So we'll talk a little bit about what our plans are for the day. So we just finished with our introductions. Next up, we'll have a really interesting presentation by Dr. Stone on microaggressions and stereotype threat. And as I mentioned, we will be taking questions, doing the question and answer series session during each of these presentations. We'll follow this up by a demonstration where Claire Becker will walk us through how to gather data and facilitate in a virtual learning environment surrounding microaggressions in your own department. And then next up, we'll have a session on how can leaders take the lead, one department's experience. Dr. Phelan will share our experiences here at MCW. We'll also have time for questions and answers there. And then we'll finish off with some scenarios and a short didactic presentation where myself and Dr. Stone will collaborate on how to respond to microaggressions and a bit more information about microaggressions and learners. And as I mentioned before, we'll always be available for questions and answers, but take any other questions that remain at the end and hopefully have a few minutes for some networking time amongst the group members here today. So if you have people who you know are attending the conference today and haven't joined the session, feel free to text them and tell them, join. We're having a good time over here in the microaggressions workshop. So, and like I said, feel free to pop in and out throughout the day. We're not, you know, we understand the length of time and we're happy to have you here. So I will relinquish screen sharing responsibilities to Dr. Stone, who will be telling us about microaggressions and stereotype threat.
Great. Good morning, everybody. I want to thank Elisa for inviting me to join the session today and contribute some thoughts about microaggressions, what happens when people are the target of those kinds of comments, statements, and what we can do about it. That's the main thing we want to really get to. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Everybody see that okay? All right. I'm going to try to put the chat up. It's always a dilemma here with the Zoom presentations as to whether you can see everybody and everything at the same time. So maybe not going to do that right away. Somebody has something in the chat, draw my attention to it, pop right in and say something. So what I want to talk about today is, and I'll go back here if I can. Oops, there we go. We want to get into talking right away about what microaggressions are and the consequences that they can bring. And, you know, a conversation like this always leads us into talking about a lot of things that sort of go wrong at work. But I want to point out right away that it's just not the case that everything's always going wrong at work in your relationships with people. Many interactions you have are very, very positive. And I think that I just want to make sure didn't miss something in the chat. Want to start by talking about the things that go right. So I want to give you a chance to sort of get involved right away and talk about some things right away. I want to start by talking about the successful relationships that you have. And I want you to think about a successful relationship you have right now where you work. And I want you to really focus on what is it about you that makes this relationship successful. And I'll give you a few minutes here to think about that. I'd like you to write down or, you know, put it in writing in some way. You can put it in the chat if you want to, but I am going to ask you to share. We're going to go around and sort of see what people are thinking about. So again, thinking of a successful relationship that you have where you work, and what is it about you, specifically about you, that makes this relationship successful? Give you a sec to think about that and get some thoughts down. All right, wrapping that up. A couple things in the chat here I think I'll put up and see if we got some ideas here. Let's see. Oh yeah, it's going to go fast on the chat. All right, maybe I'll just start right here. Anita says that the things about her that make this relationship successful are that she's collaborative and open with communication. Those are two really positive aspects of sort of working with people, isn't it? Elisa jumped in. She says, I enjoy my collaboration with the APDs and we are able to share and listen with each other. There's a theme emerging here, all right? Let's see. We have a lot of people talking about being engaging, open to new ideas. That kind of switches it a little bit. Dominic says, I enjoy working with my program director. I'm flexible, reliable, receptive to feedback. You see some of what people are focusing on is their ability to provide effective communication, but also to receive communication and be open to what others have to provide. Yeah, these are all great positive skills, working with each other in an organization, especially in, you know, medicine, right? Seeing additional perspectives, very powerful stuff, Mary Beth. Yeah, absolutely. Excellent. Well, yeah, so it's very common when I ask this question at the start of a workshop that people really focus on the way they communicate with each other. The other kinds of positive things that people think about is that their ability to support each other. And sometimes that really, you know, involves being able to listen, being able to accept other ideas, be able to take different perspectives. These are all really positive qualities. And, you know, I find that working with people in healthcare, providers, staff, these are very common attributes for people in this particular domain. So yeah, a lot of the relationships that we have are very, very successful, and it's because that we bring so many positive things to those relationships. Of course, we're here today to talk about when things don't always go so well. And that's what we're going to get into with the topic of microaggressions. Going to start by walking through the definitions so that we're all at least on the same page with respect to what we're talking about. And if you've read the Sue paper, you're familiar with the idea that microaggressions are a brief and common place daily, that's important, daily verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, whether they're intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, negative, slights, insults towards stigmatized patients, providers, staff. People that are members of underrepresented groups are often the targets of microaggressions. Now, it's the case, we think, that the perpetrators of microaggressions, people that say these kinds of things, do these kinds of things, are often unaware that they're engaging in these communications when they interact. And they're unaware of what they're doing and what they're saying, but they're probably very much unaware of the effect that it has on the people that they're directing the microaggressions toward. And they're very devastating. That's one of the things we want to talk in great detail about today. This comment is one you see a lot. The microaggressions are similar to carbon monoxide. They're invisible, but potentially lethal. And continuous exposure, daily exposure to these types of interactions can be a sort of death by 1,000 cuts to the victim. You know, we'll see examples, I'm sure, today as we go throughout where, you know, one microaggression can be pretty devastating. But when you work in an environment, an organizational environment where you're constantly exposed to them, you know, they start to add up. They have a cumulative effect that can be really powerfully devastating. There's 3 forms that they typically come in. I'm going to walk through these in some detail. Micro assaults, micro insults, and micro invalidations. There's a lot of overlap. Some people, you know, complain about this with this idea that there's a lot of overlap between these. So we'll take a look at these. The first one I want to talk about, I'm going to hide the screen here so everybody can see everything, are what we call micro assaults. Micro assaults are the more explicit, conscious, deliberate derogations that are primarily some kind of violent verbal or nonverbal attack that's really actually intended to hurt the victim through name calling, avoidant behavior, or other kinds of purposeful discriminatory actions. And you think, well, you know, how often does this happen in, you know, healthcare? There's a website that I use a lot when I'm looking for examples in different domains that you might want to take a screenshot of, or at least, you know, grab the put it in your browser right now. It's www.microaggressions.com. And it's a great website for being able to search for examples of microaggressions that are specific to particular domains or employment categories. The examples I'm going to show you are case studies with LGBTQ patients that appear on this website. So for example, one that somebody wrote about, these are actual examples of things that people say have happened. You have where a physician interacting with the patient says, "How did this happen?" The patient says, "My mother pushed me down the stairs when I told her that I'm a lesbian." And the physician said, "Oh, that's understandable then." Another example where a nurse to a patient says, "Oh, you're dressing like a lady today. You should keep that up. You make a much better girl." And that's said to a 22-year-old who identifies as a male. These are examples of microaggressions that we might argue are being done because there's intent to harm. There's actual conscious, deliberate intent to create some harm. How common is this in healthcare? Well, it probably happens more than it should, for sure. And, you know, with all the interest in implicit bias, we sometimes forget to pay attention to these more deliberate acts like this. We certainly want to do something to you know, reduce the incidences of these happening. But we also want to pay attention to the more automatic or implicit versions of this. And one form we think is what we call the micro insults. Now, these are behavioral verbal remarks or comments that convey rudeness, they convey insensitivity, or they otherwise demean a person's cultural heritage or identity. There's several examples of these, and I'll make sure you have access to the paper later if you're interested in reading in more detail. I'm just talking about 3 in particular, with examples, again, that come from microaggressions.com of where these are happening in healthcare context. One common example is the ascription of intelligence. This is where we're assigning intelligence or ability to a person on the basis of race or gender. Such as telling a Black or Hispanic patient, "You're so articulate," or asking a minority or female colleague, how did you get into that medical school? Or telling a coworker, hey, look at the color of your skin, you should know Spanish. The message that the targets of these statements here are things like, hey, people like you are generally not intelligent, or it's unusual for someone like you to be successful, or everybody from your group can speak a particular language. All Latinos speak Spanish, for example. Another example of micro insults are what's called second-class citizen. This is where people are giving preferential treatment to a majority group member over a member of an underrepresented group. So example could be a patient to a female physician. I just assume you were my nurse. I think we're going to hear a lot about that one. It's so common in healthcare. Or examples of where people have been mistaken. A physician has been mistaken. A physician of color has been mistaken as a staff member. Or ignoring patients with physical disabilities to assist patients with no physical disabilities. Another example, asking a gay or lesbian patient, do you have a wife, husband, or a girl or boyfriend? What people hear when they're the targets of these kinds of statements are, for example, people like you are servants, you can't occupy high status positions, or you just don't belong, you're a lesser being. Another example here is alien in an own land, common to assume that Asian Americans and Latino Americans are foreign born. So, common example, asking a Hispanic or Asian patient or colleague, where are you from? Where were you born? Or you speak such good English. Or assuming a Hispanic or Asian patient would need an interpreter before you even talk to them, right? And just making the assumption that they can't possibly speak English. All of these things say, hey, you're not American. You can't be as American as I am. I assume you're a foreigner from another country. And again, the assumption here is that when people are saying these kinds of things, making these kinds of comments or acting in these ways, they don't realize that they're doing it in some cases, and they don't realize the effect that it's having. The final example we'll talk about are micro-invalidations. Now, these are verbal comments or behaviors that exclude or negate or nullify the psychological thoughts, feelings, or experiential reality of a stigmatized person or group. So some of the examples here are statements like colorblindness, basically statements that say, I just don't want to acknowledge race. So telling a patient or coworker, when I look at you, I don't see color, or saying things like, there's only one race, the human race, or as long as you speak English, I don't care where you're from. The messages that these convey are things like, I don't care about your racial or ethnic experience. Or more powerfully, you should assimilate to the dominant culture. If you just become more white, you'll be fine. Other examples are denial of individual racism, statements that deny or downplay our own individual biases. So people will say things like, I'm not a racist, I have several Black or Mexican friends. Or this one's interesting, as a woman, I know what you go through as a racial minority. Examples of where people might feel like they're trying to be helpful, but they're really causing some more harm than they realize. The message that's heard from these kinds of statements are, hey, I'm immune to racism because I have friends of color. I can't possibly be racist or sexist. Or your racial oppression is no different than my gender oppression. That is invalidating people's experiences with being the target of racism, for example. And then sort of more of a macro kind of way to think about micro-invalidations are the myth of meritocracy. And these are statements that people will make that assert that race or gender play no role in health and well-being, or sort of advancement in their career. So statements like, I believe the most qualified person should get the job, or everyone can succeed in the society if they work hard enough, or any Juan Valdez can come into the ER and get a full workup. What people hear when they're the target of these statements or in the presence of these statements is, I believe that minorities and women are given extra unfair benefits because of their race or gender, or it's a stereotype that people like you are lazy or incompetent and need to work harder. So a lot of things that people do and say that, may seem really innocuous, really harmless, but have a tremendous effect on people. And when we think about what it's like to be the target of these kinds of statements on a daily basis in an organization in which people work, 1,000 cuts to the victim, we can start to point to a lot of negative impacts that it has and really on everyone. And so, for example, when microaggressions are happening in an organization on a daily basis, they essentially are signaling to the people that work there that, institutionally, we support bias, right? That there's systemic racism or there's systemic sexism. If these things are happening all the time, it must be the case that everybody accepts these as appropriate. What they do, though, is they promote and maintain a stressful climate in which to work and provide care. And so they signal to underrepresented individuals that the important group identities that they hold are marginalized and they're not valued in this organization. They force a vigilant focus on the people that are the constant targets of these statements to the risk of their health and their well-being. And they also have an effect on job performance and, importantly, prevent people from reaching their potential. Now, how is that possible, right? How is it that it gets in the way of people's ability to do their job and achieve what they're capable of achieving? And what I want to introduce is, I think, a good explanation for sort of what people go through psychologically when they're the target of microaggressions on a daily basis. So why are they harmful? And I think one explanation for what happens is the concept of stereotype threat. So what is stereotype threat? I love a definition like this. It is this. The existence of a negative stereotype means that anything one does or any of one's features that conform to it make the stereotype more plausible as a self-characterization in the eyes of others, and perhaps even in one's own eyes. And we call this predicament stereotype threat, and argue that it is experienced essentially as a self-evaluative threat. So when people are the target of microaggressions, they may experience a state of stereotype threat. And we think that there's some steps from this experience of stereotype threat to behavior that are consequential for people being able to perform up to their best at their job. So microaggressions are essentially reminders of stereotypes. And when microaggressions are sort of flourishing in an organization, what they can cause is this increased concern and anxiety in the targets of the stereotype that they're going to do something that's going to confirm the stereotype, that they're going to, through their job performance or through some other behavior, basically show the people that hold the stereotype is true about them. Now that perception of threat increases concern and anxiety. And as people become more and more concerned about, being negatively stereotyped and that anxiety takes over, it starts to overwhelm their normal cognitive capacity and emotional regulation. In other words, the resources, the psychological resources that they rely on every day to do their jobs and do their jobs really well start to become overwhelmed by this other concern that they have about the possibility of confirming a negative stereotype. And the ironic effect that has, right, is once people are being overwhelmed by these cognitive and emotional concerns, is that they actually now can't do what they would normally be able to do. And they end up, ironically, acting in ways that can confirm or be consistent with the stereotype. So we know that, once the microaggressions or this other reminders of the stereotypes are in play, people go through this process. The targets of the stereotypes go through this process of stereotype threat, and it starts to undermine their ability to do what they normally would do. And there's a number of important findings in the literature and psychology and beyond that suggests that there's going to be some, significant consequences for people when they're the constant target of microaggressions and stereotype threat. And the first one is it can overwhelm them in a way that they can't now perform well on challenging tasks. It's not so much a problem for simple things that people do on a daily basis, but the more challenging things that they normally can do well start to become undermined by that additional cognitive and emotional concern that they're dealing with. And so people actually start to perform more poorly when they're the target of stereotypes and stereotype threat. Another outcome is that stereotype threat will inhibit people from being able to learn new information or learn new skills. So again, if you're in the process of trying to learn something, master something, but you're constantly dealing with stereotype threat, then you're going to, not be able to absorb that information and possibly be able to practice efficiently those new skills. As people continue to be the target of negative stereotypes, they start to engage in more and more avoidance, and they start to disengage from what they're doing. And so we see things like, if they've got a challenging task coming up that they need to be working to get ready to perform, they actually withdraw effort to prepare. And we think that one reason that happens is, well, if they don't do well, then they'd have a good explanation for why, which is that if I'd have worked harder, I might have been able to do well. So it leads to poorer preparation for challenging tasks. There's also evidence that when stereotype threat is operating, individuals will avoid leadership positions because of the pressure that would put on them that they would rather not have, given the possibility of being negatively stereotyped in that leadership role. The other outcome is that people will avoid performance feedback. And part of the reason for that is that becomes just sort of, a common experience for them that performance feedback always seems to have, stereotypes as part of what they're being provided with. And so they avoid performance feedback because all that does is, sort of feel like it's reinforcing the stereotypes. And then you just see avoidant behavior and disengagement from wanting to interact with others, just as a way to avoid, the constant barrage of microaggressions and reminders of the stereotype. So when people are working in an environment where they're constantly being exposed to microaggressions about important identities they have, that constant exposure, becomes such a stressor for people that they eventually say, you know what, I don't need to be here anymore. Right. And they start to say, maybe, being an emergency room physician is not in the cards for me. And, we know there's a leaky pipeline in medicine, more female and underrepresented minority physicians leaving the practice of medicine. And, there's good reason to suspect that stereotype threat may be playing a role in that. To the degree, again, individuals are working in an environment where microaggressions are sort of part of their everyday experience. I'm gonna check the chat real quick. Great, okay. So who's most at risk? You may be wondering, who are the people that we really need to be thinking about with respect to, suffering stereotype threat when microaggressions are sort of happening in a healthcare organization. And it's really the vanguard of the group. It's those, number one, who most identify with the group identity at risk. So to the degree they really value their racial identity, or they really value their gender identity, or other identities they have that are, the constant target of the microaggressions, they're the ones that are going to suffer the most for being negatively stereotyped. But it's also those who care the most about their performance in that domain, and in fact have probably achieved the most success, because for them, being negatively stereotyped creates this, unfair burden that they constantly have to overcome, and they're constantly trying to work hard to be really good at what they do, and probably have some success because they have worked so hard to be really good at what they do. Those are the ones that, in fact, are going to suffer the most because they care the most, right? People who don't care, aren't highly identified, don't care about success in the domain, well, then it doesn't matter how you're evaluating them, right? They don't have as much to lose. But it's those who are most invested that are the most at risk. So the bottom line with all of this is that the daily presence of microaggressions adds stress and pressure that undercuts the motivation, the performance, and the career longevity of the most talented and motivated providers, staff, and administrators in a healthcare organization. To the degree we're allowing microaggressions to flourish in an organization, we're really taking out the people that really define the place for us, right? And so it's really, really important that we think about how best to get a handle on addressing microaggressions. Let me stop there and ask if there's any questions or comments or any thoughts people are having about what we just talked about? Any questions or thoughts about stereotype threat?
I guess I'm thinking about the role of like the additive effect of having multiple marginalized identities. For example, being a woman of color, being a disabled queer woman of color, like that has an additive effect rather than like, I think that's important to acknowledge, like the intersectional factors at play.
Absolutely. Yeah, you know, and you can imagine situations where somebody with multiple identities on one day at work, one microaggression would hit on one identity and one microaggression might hit on another. So they're dealing with stereotype threat for different identities that they hold, right? That's definitely a possibility. Okay, well, you know, lots of time to talk about this as we go through the rest of the presentations. Check one. Lisa asks, why do you think healthcare field has not recognized this to the degree that it seems the business world has? You really think the business world has? I would say higher education has definitely, you know, I think recognized it in part because the original work on stereotype threat was really about standardized testing. And so was really showing that stereotype threat affects performance on the graduate record exam, the SAT. And so, you know, the academic world has really been on top of it. And, you know, there's even been some now, I think, buy-in by ETS that their tests are biased in this or have this potential for bias. So I think the academic world was on it originally. It is making its way into the business world. And I'm going to provide some resources for everybody at the end where, you know, people have been writing, some scholars have been writing about stereotype threat in medicine going back, you know, to the early 2000s. So there's been some work. It just hasn't really taken off in the way that I think it could. And then there hasn't been a lot of research on it in medicine. That's the other place that I think we need to be paying attention to is if it is happening, how is it happening? You know, I described a way in which it can happen. And a lot of what I described comes from the academic and to some degree the business world. You'll see in the references that I've got for you to take home with you that, you know, there are some people like Diane Burgess who've written about this and, you know, really great place to start if you want to take a look at more about sort of the application of it in healthcare. Any other thoughts or questions? All right, well, let me finish by saying where we're going to go the rest of the session this morning. When we think about what we can do to get a handle on microaggressions, I like this model, we call it the double bubble model, because it really shows how the way in which microaggressions exist in an organization are both a function of the individuals in the organization and those conscious and unconscious stereotypes and prejudices that people have that lead them to say the things that they say. But I was really trying to put a little bit more emphasis on the other side of the equation here in the systemic form of the bias, right? And the institutional contributions to that, the policies and practices at the organizational level that perpetuate the existence of microaggressions that support those kinds of interactions between people. We have to pay attention to the structural elements as well, which is sort of the ways in which the institutions interact and promote this. What we're going to do for the rest of the day is talk about things we can do at the institutional level to address the systemic form of the bias. And we're going to actually start there with Claire's presentation, which will be next. And Mary Beth has a great example of how to do this from a leadership standpoint. And then at the end of the day, we'll come back to individual strategies, especially with respect to confronting people who microaggress, and how best to do that. And what do you have to think about to make that work, so that we can, sort of work it from the top down and try to make change from the leadership and the organization, and also from the bottom up to empower individuals to take control of those situations. So with that, I'm going to turn it over. I'm going to stop sharing. I'll turn it over to Claire.
Thank you so much. Give me just a moment to get my screen sharing set. And I have to laugh, as a person who is usually good with Zoom and tech. You saw me type something about logging hundreds of hours. That's on this platform, and I still sent it to everyone instead of George, as we were talking about breakout rooms in the background. So forgive me there. Don't let that mistake on my part distract you. I think we are all set now, and I am so glad to be here with you today, talking a little bit about acting on this bottom line, that microaggressions and stereotype threat ultimately add stress and tension and frustration to our working environments and our learning environments, cuts our performance, and is something that we need to move forward on. And so I'd love to welcome you all to this second section of our presentation today, where we are going to take on a bit of a simulation. And to just reintroduce myself briefly, again, I'm Claire Becker, a transition coach and design consultant. And ultimately, whether I work with individuals, leaders, or teams, my job is about helping people love what they do. And so while working at the Medical College of Wisconsin with Drs. Phelan and Hayes, we led a series of sessions on microaggressions in medicine, which ultimately were about supporting our working environment, making sure that it was inclusive and empowering space for everyone, and ultimately one that they love. And so that's where the connection comes here. And the simulation that you'll experience today is really pulled from one of the sessions that we've hosted, and I'm so glad to share it with you. So let's jump into the objectives we have for about the next hour to 75 minutes together. First and foremost, we are going to jump into a session about microaggressions with our shared SAEM 2021 Department of Emergency Medicine. Jump in there as active participants. I'll dig into that a little more closely in a moment. Afterward, we'll step back and I'll get a little bit meta with you on adult learning and working in a virtual setting to look at the key decision points and mantras and mindsets that are going to help you in session planning and facilitation on a topic like this. I'll give you in our session a facilitation readiness checklist or planner of sorts, so that you can take notes and have that as an overview to support your planning for sessions in the future on this topic or any. And then we'll make sure that by the end of our day today, you have some time for action planning, so that everything you learn here can is ready to be taken back to your home institution. With that, I just want to holistically welcome you to the table. Each of us enters this space with our own unique set of identity markers, experience, conscious and unconscious biases, and learning intentions. Whether you are here as a learner or a leader or somewhere in between like me, our experience matters, and when we show up together to share that, profound things can happen. This topic is important, and each of us have unique responsibilities in owning our response to microaggressions, supporting individuals who are experiencing stereotype, and ultimately creating an inclusive, empowering workplace that we enjoy. So we acknowledge through this session that that being true, planning for a session on microaggressions and experiencing a session on microaggressions are two different things. So I'm inviting you to the table as a whole person, bringing all of that nuance, and expect to engage as a participant today for a couple of reasons, even with all of that. I hope that in engaging in our department session this morning, you can consider more deeply your own experiences with microaggressions. You can engage in live data that we'll share together and try on that skill of jumping right in and sharing takeaway points. That as a participant, you can notice your feelings in this experience, whether you're uncomfortable or ready to jump in. Those are things to pay attention to so that if you end up facilitating a session like this on the other side, you've got that empathy built from your experience this morning. And then finally, sorry, we've got two people in the same room. All set? Okay, sorry about that. Another tech thing. Here we go. And then finally, I hope that in engaging with us this morning, you are able to receive some deeper takeaways to move this forward, because we know we are in it together. So with no further ado, I would love to welcome you to our brand new SAEM 2021 Department of Emergency Medicine. How many of us, let's see, are on this Zoom presentation today are in it together. We are 22 strong in our department. And we are here today because we really trust and understand, again, the bottom line that Jeff shared. We are here to take our own unique responsibility on working on this issue as a department and creating a really strong cultural environment. Today in our session, you can expect to engage in large group discussion via chat and coming off mute. We're going to use, not Poll Everywhere today, but Zoom polls and the chat feature to share. You can expect to engage in small group discussion. We're going to do those Zoom breakout rooms about halfway through. And you'll be able to consider our facilitation panel as a leadership panel to engage with. Throughout the time, I ask you to hold these agreements from Courageous Conversations about race with me. I invite you to experience discomfort, to accept non-closure. We will not solve this today, nor will we in a couple of conversations, and to speak your truth while honoring that others will do the same. Those three are from Courageous Conversations about race. What I ask you additionally, though, is to take the learning from this session and from small group discussions in particular, but leave the details. While we'll introduce ourselves and build a community today, let's keep the specifics of our conversations confidential so that we are ready to engage fully. I'll just check the chat real quick to see if there are any questions about those agreements. Oh, here we go. I don't see anything coming through, so let's get started. As our SAEM 2021 Department of Emergency Medicine, we come together with a set of true north statements. First, we as a unit believe that racism is a public health crisis and it must be urgently addressed. Together, we are committed to examining our own biases, ending racial disparities in healthcare, and being proactively anti-racist by changing culture, systems, organizational structures, policies, practices, and attitudes. This is our true north statement written by our department leadership. On an individual level, we've translated that to a department pledge. Together, we commit to building an inclusive community where all talents and knowledge are valued and supported. So I want to check in here because as this department has existed for about 6 minutes, I want to give you a moment to check in with these true north statements and your readiness to engage with them. And so I'm going to start a poll. And the first question that I'd like to ask you is, on a scale of 1 to 5, 1 being low, 5 being high, how ready are you to be committed to these true north statements? We are about halfway through voting, so feel free to drop in with your readiness. These are anonymous polls. We're operating in high confidentiality today, so feel free to share where you are. Okay, we're above 80%, so I'm going to go ahead and share those results. As we can see, as a department, we are above 75% ready to be committed to these true north statements, that this is something that we can sign on with. I want to thank you for the folks who put 2 or 4 or are considering where they still are, as this is a big question, and honor where you are with the invitation for further conversation if something here is not catching for you. The next question that I want to ask, because the work in microaggressions is not just about our commitment, but our readiness to take action. And so our second poll is going to ask you, to what extent are you ready to be supported, pushed, and expected to live up to these true north statements through feedback, coaching, or one-on-one conversations with your peers? And I'm going to go ahead and start that poll now so that you can share your response. We're about halfway there, so feel free to jump in and share your response to this poll. Okay. I'm going to go ahead and share those results. Here again, in these 2 questions that we've asked, we see that the majority of our department is ready to be supported, pushed, and expected to live up to these statements, which is excellent. Now, it doesn't mean we have to be perfect, but it is that question of, are we ready to take it into action and have the conversations we need to get there? If you were high on your readiness to be pushed and supported, then I invite you to work to support an environment through the rest of our session today where all voices are encouraged and heard, and create the space to listen. If you marked that you were lower, 3 or a 4 on your readiness, consider what you might want to share or ask to me privately in a chat or another facilitator directly, or in your small group when we get there, so that you get what you need to engage. All right. So now that we have checked our true north statements and the fact that 1, yes, we are committed to them, absolute majority, and 2, we are ready to be pushed and supported to having, to bringing these true north statements into action, I'd like to invite you to take a moment and pulse check with us as a department where we are in relation to those statements. And the way that we're going to do that is engaging in an anonymous and confidential microaggressions survey. I'm going to drop the link in the chat. If you would like to take it, if you're able to take the link from there. Otherwise, you can access this brief survey via smartphone by pointing your camera app at the QR code on the screen. Like I said, this is anonymous and confidential, and I ask that everyone, our MSAs and moderators and otherwise, take this survey briefly so that we can get a ton of data to work with during our time. So what I'm going to do is going to pause for about 3 minutes so that you can take that survey, 3 to 5. Please send any questions to me directly in the chat. All right, I'm going to give us just one moment more because we have more than half of our responses in and they're still trickling in. I so appreciate that for you sharing your experience so that we can really deeply engage in how our department is doing in creating a workspace free of microaggressions where we can all really thrive. Okay, with that coming in, I believe my data still will update live, but I am looking forward to sharing with you. So in a moment, we are going to review the data live. I am just going to pull it up on my screen and narrate what I see. So anything can happen Tuesday today. And what I'll ask you to do with me is pay attention to what you notice and what stands out in the data. Are there strengths that you see in the way that our department is living up to this department pledge and creating a work environment free of microaggressions? Are there areas to focus? And ultimately, the core question that we will consider here in a moment and then in breakout groups is, to what extent does this data provide evidence of our ability to live up to our pledge? And that, again, is building an inclusive community where all talents and knowledge are valued and supported. So with that, let's dig in here. If I can do a quick screen check that this data is now available on the screen. Yes, beautiful. Okay, so we have all engaged in this immediate Microsoft Forms, which makes data compilation look really easy. And so the first question was about relating the types of microaggressions that we see. And our group has experience related to age, sex, and race or ethnicity, that they have seen this present. And with 16 total responses, you can see that almost everyone who responded to the survey saw that they had noticed that they had seen microaggressions related to race or ethnicity. And so that's interesting to look at. About half of us, though, really noticed ones for age, and everything that was less than half of our group. In the incidents above, those recipients were a mix here. It seems like we are equally able to notice microaggressions as when we are the victims of them, as listening and seeing that true for another person. Oh, behind me. Yeah, okay. Then we have two more questions. How often do you see microaggressions at work? Here, no one has said never. I have, which is interesting to see. And then we have a pretty even split between monthly, weekly, or daily. It is interesting to see that only about 25% of our department sees these daily, 75% see less than that. So I wonder what there is to speak about in that experience. The next question shows that about half of us say that yes, when I see microaggressions at work, I want to respond, or I would respond. And the other half say it depends. I think this makes total sense, as this is a new topic for our department. Our pledges are new, and so we are striving to embody them. And it's interesting how it relates to our earlier questions around to what extent are we committed to these statements and are ready to be pushed, engaged, or supported. And so I wonder about how we can work with that it depends group to support them in living up to these responsibilities. Here are some things to consider that informed whether or not we would respond. One, just desire to be an ally, that complacency is no longer acceptable, that it's an educational opportunity. And if we are living up to our department pledge and stance on racism, we have to treat it as an educational opportunity. We're in this together. I also see here personal examples and situational awareness of who is present. Thank you. The next question I asked was, if and when you respond, what do you commonly do or say? Here we see a variety of strategies from, it seems like, really practice clauses. I heard you say, or I noticed that you, that some folks have go-tos, which can really help. And in other spaces, it depends, or perhaps there's an ability to use humor to alleviate the situation a bit. Then I asked, what holds you back from responding to microaggressions? The majority of, well, I guess about a third of our responses say none of the above. That's something that I'm really curious about learning more, and what it is specifically, or other. That makes half of our group actually not related to either I'm not sure it would be helpful, I have concerns about safety, or I'm worried my response will make things worse. I have a lot of curiosity about that and hope to learn more from small group discussions around what that means. And then finally, a space for additional comments or questions. Thank you for sharing these. Okay. Our department makeup right now is majority female, and it is majority 41 to 60, and majority faculty today. So as I move that data, I hope you got a chance to consider these questions again with me. Thank you again so much for sharing your experience, so we have a rich data set to look at. Because our core question now is, again, to what extent are we as a department living up to the pledge? And here I would like the opportunity now to send you to small groups to discuss this. We are going to be in groups of about 7 or 8 if my math in my head works. And I'd love to make sure that before you get started, you know everyone's name and institution, with that high emphasis on our earlier agreement of taking the learning, leaving the details, and making sure you are creating a safe and confidential space to discuss. And then I invite you to consider those reflections on the data as you saw it. What did it say? What did it suggest to you? And what action would you propose we take based on the data and our goal of living up to this pledge? Then in the last couple of minutes, I'll send a time warning so that you can have some closing discussion to report back. All of these questions I am going to provide for you in a survey. And let me drop that link in the chat again here. So this survey is all open-ended, and I invite you to consider it as a discussion guide for anybody like me who forgets the instructions as soon as they get to a breakout room. Let's see if I can find the chat. And I do ask you to designate one person as a note taker. The question that I really strongly hope that you respond to, although all of them are optional, is the last one about action, because we will use your data for that in the final part of this session with me. So for what, oh, here we go. So there is the link in the QR code if you want to open that on your phone. Otherwise, the chat link is now open. If everybody opens that quickly, you'll have access to it once you get into breakout rooms. And before I have George send us into cyberspace, I just want to make room for any questions before we jump in. Okay, so then with that, we are going to spend about 20 minutes, as you saw in this overview agenda, to chat in the breakout rooms around what you're seeing in our data set and how it relates our ability to live up to this pledge together as a department. George, thank you so much for sending us there. With that, we will see you back here at 10:45 to discuss those takeaways, and in particular, that last question of the discussion guide that I've sent you in that link. Thank you. All right, welcome back. Thank you so much for being here back with us as we continue on. If you have joined us recently, I will let you know that we are in the middle, or nearing the end, I should say, of the SAEM 2021 Department of Emergency Medicine department meeting. This is a simulation, and for the last about half hour or so, we have the 20 or so of us on the call have been working together as a department to figure out where we stand in relation to a department pledge, of valuing and honoring all sorts of knowledge and experiences, and building a place where each of us can thrive. And so this may seem a little bit out of context. I want to name that for you, but so welcome you as we wrap up this section to join us in participating. So before I go forward, what I'd love to do is do a quick pulse check on how those discussion groups went. Because as a department, like we said, meeting this bottom line of if we've got microaggressions present, our work environment is going to be have excess stress, more than is necessary, and ultimately cut our performance and our collective ability to really serve and impact patients. And so I want to check in on how these individual small breakout rooms went and your experience there, because it represents our commitment to each of us holding responsibility for this topic. So I'm going to open a new poll about your belief in the direction of this conversation. So in our simulated Department of Emergency Medicine together, from our conversation, to what extent do you believe the department is headed to becoming a more inclusive and anti-racist place to work based on your experience? Go ahead and share your take on a scale of 1 to 5. We're coming in about half of our participants voted so far. As a reminder, this is totally anonymous poll, so feel free to share your take. And because maybe break has extended for some folks, I'm going to pause us there and share those results. We can see here that the majority of us rated a 4 or 5, being the highest scale, that we are ready to head into a more inclusive and anti-racist place to work, given our commitment so far. Next, I want to check in on the space that you created, each of you. Because our spaces matter for each of us to take ownership. And so now I'm curious, on a scale of 1 to 5, how safe did you feel to engage throughout the breakout space? We hit that halfway mark. See if anybody else would like to share. Okay, I'm going to share those results back. All of us put either a 4 or a 5, and that's something that I'd like to celebrate, because our pledge is not to be perfect. Our pledge is to support, coach, and push each other to meet that bar of understanding our conscious and unconscious bias and working toward an environment without microaggressions. And so for us to put that we're feeling safe means that we can invite each other to step in even further. The next question I want to ask is about your contribution, because we know that sometimes for microaggressions and other topics like this, not everyone feels equally willing to participate. So I wonder how many of us feel like we were able to contribute our perspective or experience? Okay, I'll share that back. All of us again put 4 or 5, and this is something that I want to celebrate and share gratitude for. Again, if we are a department who's going for this great environment to work in, it's about all of us stepping in and sharing our experience, and the nuance of that is going to support us in our growth. Final rapid fire question today is just about your take on your interest in continuing this conversation as a department. Share your perspective based on how this conversation started if you're looking forward to more opportunities. We'll give us a moment for a couple more votes to come in. Okay, I will step us there and share the results. Once again, all of us said at 1 to 5, either a 4 or a 5, that you are looking forward to more conversations at our department level. If you are a 4 and had a reason for not putting 5 that comes to mind, it would be really beneficial for you to share that with us so that we can continue to enhance this experience as a department as we learn and grow together. And we understand that that is true for us as facilitators too. So as we wrap up this department learning session on microaggressions in medicine and how it contributes to our ability to live up to our department pledge, I wanted to share back the ideas for next steps that we received from the breakout spaces. So in this chart, you'll see that we have 5 ideas for next steps. 1, increase talking about this topic regularly. 2, being aware immediately. So I think this is about responding to a person who has shared a microaggression immediately, adjusting the culture of medicine, making people more accountable for their microaggressions, and connecting this topic to patient and staff safety. These are the ideas for next steps from our department meeting today, but I would love to get your input before we move forward. And so I invite you now to treat this as a big old whiteboard. And if you are able, click on the screen you can see and check in to see if you have an option called annotate. And if you could, please click annotate and then mark a tally or circle or put in an emoji next to the action step you have most energy for. And can I get a check to make sure that people have the annotation feed?
Claire, are you right clicking or how did you do that?
Unfortunately, I'm not sure if annotate is enabled on this call.
Claire, I think you're muted.
Thank you for that. Okay, so annotation is not available. So here's what I think I can do. 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. If you want to drop in the chat which of these boxes you have most energy for as our next step, that still provides really meaningful data for us. Thank you. Thanks, Rebecca, for getting us started. All right. Virtual facilitation on the fly. Thank you so much. I see those coming in. What I'm noticing is a lot of 3 and 4. So that is 3 a tall order for each of us to work toward that adjusting the culture of medicine. And 4, perhaps something more tactical that we could pursue as a department around what kind of structures for accountability would we want in our culture and how would we be able to invite people into that process. Thank you so much for sharing where your energy is today and bringing us in and participating as really important members of our department. I'm going to see what I can do to get rid of this. This marks the end of our department meeting for this wonderful SAEM 2021 Department of Emergency Medicine. We invite you to come back anytime. You are welcome here. And again, thank you so much for engaging in this facilitation with us today. Whew. Okay, so I am stepping out of facilitator mode and back into Claire at the real SAEM conference. With so much gratitude for trying that on with me. I want to take a moment to locate where we are in this session component. So we have just engaged in a simulation about microaggressions in medicine. As I shared with you at the beginning, a large proportion of what you experienced, we directly performed and executed with our team at the Medical College of Wisconsin. From here, I'm going to spend just a few more minutes with you talking through the key decision points and mindsets you might want to consider for effective session planning. If a session like this caught your attention and you want to know what we were thinking about behind the scenes, that is what I'll bring you into. And I'm also going to share a facilitation planner with you. I'm dropping that document into the chat so that you can download it. And I also will put a link, if that is easier to access, so that you can download this document. And that has virtual text boxes, so you can follow along with us now with your own notes as it serves you to be able to hit the rest of our experiential objectives for today. All right. So the first thing that I wanted to do related to those is just give you a moment to think back on the experience you just had as a participant in a microaggressions in medicine departmental conversation. And I have two questions that I really would love to not be rhetorical for you to either come off mute and share or share your experience in the chat. The first one is, what value did this simulation provide for you? And the second question I have is, what was your major takeaway from engaging here? So again, I so appreciate you sharing your thoughts either in chat or feel free to jump off mute with us. I'd love to hear your experience.
As a student, I found it very comforting to know that, to hear that so many faculty and staff members find this to be a priority. It's very reassuring, validating.
And I thank you so much for jumping off in our conversation here.
My biggest takeaway was getting to speak with physicians from all across the U.S. and seeing how we have so much in common as far as microaggressions, and we have similar ideas on how to go about just improving the workplace, and so that was reassuring as well.
Yeah, Jeanette, as I listen to you and connect to what Anna shared, I think about the wondering of, if upon entering this session today, you wondered if you were alone, the answer is no. The answer is absolutely no. Are there any other reflections or takeaways that are valuable to share with this group before we move forward? Ria echoes that appreciation for perspective and that this topic needs a both top-down and bottom-up approach. Absolutely, and I'm looking forward to parts of a presentation still to come where we can tackle that. All right, well, I welcome you to continue to share reflections, not just in your own notes, but in the chat, so that we can continue to build off of other folks' ideas as I take us forward to step behind the scenes and get a little bit meta of how our team went about positioning adult learners at the center and planning for a session like the one that you just experienced. And I'm going to do this through two lenses behind the scenes. And like I said, you've got that facilitation planner now that's going to cover this topic as well. I think about planning for adult learners with two lenses that are both equally important. One is setting a really clear vision, and two is preparing with attention to that vision. Not necessarily to the content itself, but to the vision you set. And that's a distinction that I want to share early and often here. And so what we'll do in the next couple of minutes is look at vision setting and then looking at preparation with attention to that vision. And I'll share with you a bit of our process. So when it comes to setting a vision, first I want to talk about setting a vision for outcomes. And here I invite you to consider both the short term and the long term, because sessions like this prompt conversation. They prompt that aspiration for action and lots of follow-up. And so you want to be ready with a sense of how that locates for you in a grander arc of professional development. On the short term, we got really clear on what we wanted department members to do, believe, think, or ask as a result of this session. If you heard as I was facilitating over and over again, I said, all of us take responsibility. Each of us have a role. That was because we set a vision that said all of our department members will believe that this is their business. And so it directly impacted what I was sharing with you as we experienced that session. Then we also said, what is another vision we set around outcomes was around what leadership outcomes, what they would be willing and able to do as a result of this session in the short term. Considerations like if lots of folks had questions, would our leadership have available time for one-on-one meetings or debriefs on this content? Is that an outcome we could expect and be prepared to share? Or is there other action that they could take? In the long term, those questions are similar, but of course, a parallel arc. So considering the outcomes, right? Eliminating microaggressions in our work environment or supporting each other every time they come up so that they happen less and less frequently. What role do the department members have in these long-term, in the long term, and how can you speak to that and preview that in this session so that they're considering a grander arc? And then, of course, leadership again, in the long term, maybe not in the next couple of weeks, but in the long term, what preparation and what is leadership prepared to do in relation to this topic? That is really important to consider as we look at something like the heat map around accountability structures. For example, if we saw that, how would we relate that to our leadership readiness to set accountability and hold people to it? These are things that you want to know in advance of seeing that pop up on a slide. After you consider the vision for the outcomes of the session, consider the vision for the experience of the session. And here, as we were planning, we looked through 3 layers. First and foremost, we considered the participant engagement experience. Because we believe our department is what's going to make this succeed or less than, and we really wanted them to buy into the process. And so before we got into the nitty-gritty of the session, we asked ourselves 2 questions. How will participants engage with leaders, with each other, and with the content of the session? And 2, what feedback will participants be able to share? This mattered because related to a longer arc, you want to continue engagement and investment from your participants. And one way you do that is you ask for feedback and you act on it. Then we considered the leader engagement experience. Leadership has a really interesting role in sessions like this for adult learners because leaders can either support a message or sometimes they can make spaces feel more safe or sometimes less safe or less vulnerable. And so we wanted to be really clear in our vision for leader engagement. We considered as a team, what are the roles leaders play in the session and how will that benefit the space? Then we talked about how will we make these leadership roles transparent in the session. One thing that played out in today's session, as I'm reflecting on this now, is we had previously decided not to send our presenters today to the small groups, because we didn't want us to arrive and then become the people who answer questions instead of allowing that group to talk. And we thought that that would ultimately benefit your experience. So we did that on purpose. But as I reflect back, I didn't share that with you up front. I could have. And if we were a real department having relationships over a long period of time, I'd want to say, our leaders won't be attending small groups because we care about that space being accessible for you and supporting your willingness to share. So you can expect that, and so folks aren't surprised. Then finally, we considered a vision for the environment and culture of the session itself. How do we want this experience to feel? And what can we do proactively and reactively to share that? I think about my vision for culture of this session of wanting it to feel really seamless on Zoom. And what did I do? Chatted to everybody about logistical notes and needed to shift the way that we did our heat map. But I hope that I represented levity and inviting, and we don't have to be perfect in that space because it's certainly something that I wanted to share with you so that you could give yourself the same grace and share it with others. So this first piece, again, is around vision for the session. And here are the takeaways that I'd love to share with you. It's important to consider content not just through the lens of objectives, but for the vision of the outcomes that come with that and the experience that participants, leaders have, as well as the session environment and culture you create. And so I would love to just pause for a moment to have that sit with you. There are 3 action planning questions on the slide for you to free write on, and there's also correlated with open text boxes in the planner that I sent you. Feel free to pause for a moment and synthesize this for yourself. All right, I'm going to take us forward now from planning for a session like this through the lens of vision to that preparation with the attention to vision. And as you saw in the slide a little bit ago, I'm going to think about our preparation through 3 lenses. One is data. The second one is engagement, again, because it is so important. And the third is leader facilitation and prep. I want to start with data because you can't improve what you don't measure, right? I'm not sure who said it, but it's a very common and true thing. And so as we considered our vision, we knew that we needed to be able to collect a lot of data to be able to be responsive to our participants in our department and be able to track our improvement over time. So our data plan included that microaggression survey you experienced, pre and post feedback surveys. You saw an element of that in the live polling we did around, do you believe we're on the right track? Did you feel safe? Did you contribute? And would you look forward to this, right? That's part of the post feedback survey. We took data through heat maps, which we just did live together on the fly. And we monitored and saved our chat for anecdotal data in sessions. Here's what we noticed in all of that data collection. One really prominent thing from our first session, was the idea of, for emergency medicine physicians in particular, to name the context in which we're talking about microaggressions. Our first microaggressions survey didn't say in the administrative office or in the department as a space. And so it was open. Well, are microaggressions happening from patients in the ED or are they in the department setting? And we found that our faculty had really strong and differing responses of what to do depending on those settings. And so really clear attention to language mattered for us to be able to cultivate a discussion about just one topic without wandering back and forth. You also saw today that our data plan included processing really fast. We jumped directly into that live data today, and then you took it straight to breakout rooms. And so from an adult learning perspective, we learned lessons around how long adults and our faculty and staff and learners preferred to process data and how we could support them to do that with more time with different strategies. The last 2 bullets I'll just notice as a cohort, when you consider data, folks will only take the same survey so many times without seeing action in between those. And so it was really important in those short and long-term outcomes of the session vision to consider what could we do in between surveys to continue that engagement and investment in this as a group. And so with those lessons, and of course, having experienced the majority of that data plan today, I invite you to take a couple of notes for your own action planning. When you think about data, what's your major takeaway? And how would you like to implement that takeaway? And again, I'll just pause for a moment for you to engage either with the planner or your own notes to synthesize that. All right, I'm going to move us forward now to engagement. I focus on engagement because collective change requires a collective, right? We have to be in it together. Engagement also really matters in the pre-session, during the session, and after any given session, because it builds trust and reliability for the department members or participants. It shows through your actions that this isn't a one and done, right, but something that we're working on together. Our engagement plan included the microaggressions survey in advance of the session that we had, with some framing and email communication. And we engaged a session planning community early on as we started to tackle this topic. This made sure that folks knew that this topic was coming. It showed ways to engage and an invitation for our whole faculty, which I think really mattered. During you experience these things. This was not a we're going to speak at you session, but rather quick moving and participant centered. You engaged in polling and chat, breakouts, and the heat map to be able to show in a confidential or an anonymous way where your energy was. And hopefully that gave you the feeling of being valued. And then post-session, we sent out a post survey, again with thank yous and follow-up. And we are currently working on forming an action group to be able to respond to that where the energy was in our own department's heat map. What we learned for engagement is that anonymity matters in some contexts more than others, and to some people more than others. Our groups for different sessions, sometimes we're all learners, or sometimes we're mixed between faculty, staff, and learners. And who was in the room mattered to certain folks, especially staff and for learners, around creating that space. And so it might be something you consider with engagement. Another thing that we thought about was every time you ask folks to engage, you've got to be prepared to affirm, honor, and respond. And so sometimes the engagement that you get back is surprising. It is a direct disagreement with the topic or otherwise. And so it's important from a facilitation perspective to be ready for that, because you can't create an engaged environment if we're shutting down spaces. We want to continue to pull out and direct the engagement. And then finally, if we want higher engagement, we need to have higher action, because those two things go together and build investment. So these are our learnings from the engagement plan we created for, again, a series of sessions on the topic of microaggressions in medicine. And I'd love to give you a moment to step back and synthesize that for yourself of what you might want to consider in your own action planning if this is a session topic you want to bring to your institution. All right, I'll move us forward to the third lens of preparation, which focuses on leadership and facilitation. This is so important to focus on because leaders must facilitate and participate. And there's a really delicate nuance and role for them to play to share the space, not over dominate, invite it, demonstrate and model vulnerability, and otherwise. And so our facilitation plan included real attention to who we selected for our facilitators. We created a guide and scripted key points that we could all be sure that we wanted to share directly and accurately together. We reviewed that guide, adapted it so that it fit each of us, and we named specific roles for facilitation. Because this, in our session today, you saw me facilitate our whole scope, but we were sharing facilitation across 4 or 5 people, and so wanted to make that feel really seamless. We also created clear expectations on what each leader would or would not share or do. And we rehearsed that so that each of us could stay within our boundaries, knowing the weight of different voices and our ability to respond to our participants. What we noticed is that boundaries are important for all leaders. Sometimes leaders are called to the table to facilitate on a topic like this, and they feel new to the topic. That's okay. It's good for leaders to be able to share that with each other behind closed doors so that you can find a way to support and respond to the needs of the group as they come up. We also found that more time, not less time, is great for rehearsal and review. Sometimes we didn't give ourselves enough and we were finding 15 minutes here and there and jumping on Zoom. And I know all of us would have appreciated having more space. Then finally, these are nuanced and important topics to discuss with lots to dig into. And so to not just assign and rehearse roles, but create space for leaders to discuss really thoroughly the topics at hand in a closed door space, so that when they come together, they can represent a united front toward the department commitment or pledge or what have you. With these being our learnings, I wanted to take a moment for you to consider what this means to you based on who you are and who you might consider facilitating with. I'll give you just a moment to synthesize this. All right. I know that you have all of these prompts in that planner. If you haven't downloaded it already, please do. As we begin to close this part of our session today, I wanted to just synthesize that approaching learning sessions or discussion sessions like this are so critical and important, and I really encourage you to take them on with two things in mind, right? Setting a vision so that you're clear on the short-term and the long-term scope of what this means for your department, and being able to plan with intention and attention to those vision points, so that you can create an experience that really centers participants, builds discussion and engagement, and gives you the data and feedback to be able to build and grow over time. So here for a moment, I'll check in with the objectives that we committed to at the beginning of our time together. At this point, we're far past that simulation, and I hope that you have been able to dig deeply from your experience, as well as the meta we just discussed, on major takeaways to bring this to your institution so we can continue conversations like this. The last thing that I encourage you to do from our time together is to create an action plan. What I've done on the last page of your planner is put all of the components that we considered, so that you can start to draft some outlines and name some people to form a coalition with at your institution and get a conversation like this started. I want to check in with our time with Dr. Hayes. I'm happy to take a little bit of Q&A immediately, or action plan, or for you to drop it in the chat for us to come back to later. But more than anything, I really do want to say thank you for engaging with me today and jumping into this simulation. It's a pleasure to facilitate with a team like this and to move this conversation forward.
Yeah, thank you, Claire. We definitely have time for questions if people want to ask anything specific to your excellent facilitation.
Sounds great.
I have a question with regards to what you mentioned about from the beginning getting some sort of kind of commitment from the leadership about what is possible and what they're committed to doing. I think so often sometimes these conversations for a department are meant to allow people to vent and feel heard, and some of the actions are not known at the beginning. Like they're not sure how the conversation will go. And so how do you tone that down and create what you said that we should present from the beginning, like what the leadership is committed to doing and acting on?
Thank you for that question. I know Dr. Phelan is here beside me, putting her headphones in to respond.
Hi there. Oh my gosh.
We heard you for a second, Dr. Phelan, then you went away.
Hi there. Yeah, Claire and I are in the same room, and we were experiencing some audio. That's a fantastic question, and I think every single person had that question. I'm going to actually be speaking quite a bit in detail of how we're addressing this by engaging our leadership team more. I will say the heat map is really the way that we are going to proceed. And some of the suggestions from our heat map really are going to be best moved forward when we can be in person. And as we are able to do that, we are going to be moving forward on those actions. One in particular that was suggested and received a lot of lots of votes was simulated sessions on how to respond to microaggressions. And I would say that I would expand that to see how leadership would respond to a microaggression. To someone, if someone brought that to a leader, what is that leader going to do? Or if a leader was, found themselves to be part of a microaggression, what would that look like? So I think the heat map is the way that we are going to move forward, because that is how the faculty in our department anyway, we're engaged in an action plan. I hope that was helpful, and I hope what I'm going to speak about next will be helpful as well.
If there are no other questions, I am happy to move us forward and introduce Dr. Phelan, who is going to continue our conversation in the direction of leaders.
Good morning, everyone. Can everyone hear me? Is the volume okay? Nope.
Oh, yeah. That's great.
Good. Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for your continued attention this morning. We heard Dr. Stone's expertise on how impactful microaggressions are to individuals and to organizations. And Claire has expertly taken us through the same facilitated faculty meeting that we engaged in our department as a follow-up to actually 2 pre-meetings. So as Dr. Hayes mentioned, when she arrived in 2019 with her expertise and in microaggressions, we decided to bring this to our department as a learning experience and to find out what people in our department thought about microaggressions. And when we got the feedback, we then brought that to our residents. And that really set the stage for the facilitated faculty meeting to create an action plan. And today I'm going to focus on department leadership because that was a huge ask from our faculty. And really it's critical for leadership to be very engaged if we're going to follow through on the other heat map suggestions. So the why, our overview today is, I'm going to talk about why start with leaders, followed by what our faculty wanted and just sort of broad feedback from our session. Talking about where our leaders find themselves on their leadership journey related to microaggressions, and what we are beginning, so we haven't fully started, but what we are beginning to do to support our leaders in gaining those necessary skills. This is an emerging area in medicine. If you look, this recent publication trend was produced by one of our library scientists who we have dedicated to our department. And we can see that there's momentum gaining in this area of research and literature. And with that in mind, as I go through each of those questions, I'm going to go back and forth between our MCW responses and what is in the literature to support some of our next steps. So the why. We know that, and what I was seeing in the chat, and I can see what others were seeing, is that there is not only expectation for accountability, but I imagine expectations for leader accountability. And if you think about it, leaders, and the leaders I'm focusing on for the purposes of this conversation, are our I mean, without chair support, this is never going to happen. And our chair is completely on board with this. The focus group of leaders that we're looking at are our mid-level leaders, our vice chairs, our division chiefs. They are really responsible for that day-to-day interaction in emergency medicine. And we are all responsible, if you're in a leadership role, not only for our current state, but the future direction of emergency medicine. Where do we want to take emergency medicine as a specialty? Specific to our department, we've undergone significant change. In a period of 3 years, our faculty size has almost doubled, and our leadership team has grown and matrixed, and I'm going to share that with you in a few moments. Additionally, the current literature really mentions over and over again how critical leadership accountability is to reducing microaggressions, to be able to create that diverse, equitable, and inclusive environment we all want. I would love to take a moment here and ask if anyone in the group has any sort of experience with number 3, which is an evidence-based, data-driven, and transparent approach to evaluating microaggressions and reporting. If anyone has experience with that or knows anyone who does, please reach out in the chat. This is something our faculty want, and it's an area we're really struggling to gain traction on the best next steps. So a little bit about emergency medicine faculty nationwide. And this is the most robust data I could find. And in 2015, the academic emergency medicine faculty looked like this, mostly white and mostly male. And if we look at our own emergency department, we are also mostly white and mostly male. One thing that I'm very proud about our department is that the grassroots accomplishments and efforts have been strongly supported by both our previous chair and our current chair. These grassroots efforts have been around gender equity, and the really, again, every time you embark on some of these processes, everyone benefits. I think at first it can look like, oh, family leave just benefits women, but all the men in our group take family leave. Our family leave policy enabled us to pivot when a young man unexpectedly had a serious medical problem and had to leave our department for several months. We knew how to support him. And so the fact that our grassroots efforts are supported and benefit the whole department is a huge positive. This is what our leader group looks like. Again, you can see that it looks very similar to the 2015 emergency medicine academic faculty overall, mostly male and mostly white. If you look at the way our leadership is structured, it's matrixed. And so if you can see along the left-hand side are all of our division chiefs, and at the top, all of our vice chairs. And so you can imagine that most faculty are going to interact with one or more of these leaders every day. And those are the leaders that might actually have that opportunity to make a faculty member feel welcomed, or they may unintentionally commit a microaggression, and that looks like the entire leadership is on board with that. Or they may not exactly know how to manage if someone brings them a microaggression. Our leadership team is made up of a variety of leaders, some of whom have held leadership roles for many years, others who are new mid-level leaders for the very first time. So this is a moment to think and perhaps put in the chat any of your own observations as you think of your own department or division leadership team. What are the demographics? Are most of your team long-standing leaders, or are there mostly leaders who have a new role or some combination of the two? Who is and is not represented by your leadership team? And kind of at the last minute, I added this question, how are grassroots efforts supported in your department? I think for our department, the fact that the chairs, both chairs, supported both not only in voice, but in action and in dollars, these grassroots efforts really gives the department a sense that they would be willing to move forward on other efforts. Does anyone have any observations to share? Okay, we'll move on. So with that in mind, I can say very confidently that our emergency medicine leadership team is committed to mitigating microaggressions and really see it as a necessary step to promote an inclusive culture. So what about solution implementation? Well, I think we have to look at our leadership team and look at the makeup and realize that many of us don't have the experiences that other department members may have. Many of us may unknowingly commit microaggressions and further reduce the opportunity to meet our goal to mitigate microaggressions. I think that this study is one that really highlights the importance of understanding your blind spots. And forgive me if everyone has looked at this study, but this was well done. It's one of those studies where you go, wow, I wish I could have thought of that. So the team at Stanford took looked for real life microaggressions in academic medicine nationally. And they came up with 34 gendered microaggressions and created 34 videos of these microaggressions. And they had dollars to support, so they used actors. And they also then created 34 corresponding control videos that were the same situation without the microaggressions. And these were gendered microaggressions. And so the bottom line was that when men and women from 4 different institutions from all over the country looked at these videos, there was a statistically significant higher frequency of microaggressions noticed by women than men. Yet there was very, very strong agreement for the videos that didn't have microaggressions. So what they concluded was that it's really like this, that privilege is often invisible to those who have it, whereas bias and discrimination are readily apparent to those who experience it. And their conclusion also is understanding or knowing about microaggressions will allow for solutions to mitigate these disparities in medicine. So I wanted to come back and let you know that we used these 2 videos from this paper in our early discussions with our faculty and residents to get conversation going, to find out if people had experienced similar microaggressions, to find out what they would do if they had or if they observed them. So this is a very powerful tool if you want to generate discussion back at your institution. The resources are linked at the very end in my resources from the Stanford Respect Project. So I want to kind of conclude with this statement, which really hit home for me because right now I'm a mobile person. I'm physically in very good health, and I definitely don't see the world the same way as someone in a wheelchair. Although, as emergency physicians, we know we see people begin their day in one situation and end their day in another. But we have to realize where we have blind spots, where we really don't understand another person's experience. And I completely agree that, especially at the top of the org chart, or in this case, sort of at the middle of the org chart, we really need to work to have people uncover their unconscious bias, understand how they can not only how they might be contributing to microaggressions, but how they can have the tools to solve the problem. So in follow-up from our facilitated faculty session, we found out that faculty had three specific buckets of takeaways. One is they said our session was not enough, that they wanted more. They thought we were doing too much talking and not enough action. So that was one group of people. The feedback was very direct, and which to me was a positive, because it seems like they felt like it was safe enough to give some direct feedback that was very right on target, but a little hard to read. And then we had another group of faculty who were very encouraged and wanted to begin the process of being engaged and wanted to know how they could do more. And then I think it's important to realize that you are going to have a group of faculty who think we don't really need to, we're doing enough, we don't need to talk about this anymore, that everyone is in a good place and we need to move on. And just as a leadership team, when you're getting this type of feedback, it's important to realize that your response needs to take all of this feedback in mind. So this was our general faculty feedback. And then when we look at what our faculty wanted from leadership, they want action. So I saw the word accountability come up in the heat map. And our faculty had the same questions and same asks. What does it look like? How will a leader hold themselves accountable? How will they hold others accountable? What is our department and our institutional leadership committed to supporting in terms of time and resources to create a response? And we really wanted to start with leaders because we saw how deeply our MCW EM faculty wanted to engage. And we wanted to make sure that the leadership team was a positive part of the process. This is another very recent study that looked at experiences of underrepresented faculty in pediatric emergency medicine. And this is very likely a faculty leader saying that they feel comfortable calling out microaggressions among their peers, but even as a leader didn't feel comfortable saying anything to leadership. And you can see that this person wasn't worried that they would get fired, but they might be excluded. And so our leadership needs to know that there are faculty who view a leadership team or person like this, and we need to work to overcome that. The other, one of the reasons I'm very interested in this is that I really do believe that learners and faculty often know where their resources are, either personal or professional. And there has been a lot of work dedicated to helping individuals respond to microaggressions. I really think that leaders and the institutional leadership need to be a big part of the solution to create an environment where microaggressions don't occur and to create accountability for that when they do. And so overall, our faculty really want action. We saw the pledge that kind of brought us together. Many of our faculty had not negative things to say about the pledge in general, but wanted to make sure we knew that that wasn't enough. And all of our faculty want to work toward a culture of inclusion. So I'm going to take a break here. You know, if you've got our why it's important to engage leaders, the fact that our faculty want leaders engaged in addressing microaggressions, what would your next steps be in your department if you were going to begin this process? So a couple of questions to ask yourself. What kind of chair or chief support do you have? I mean, we're really fortunate in our department. Our chair is 100% on board and is open to hearing all suggestions moving forward. Another question to ask yourself, and this is critical, unless you yourself are a diversity, equity, and inclusion expert, what access do you have to individuals with this expertise? What institutional initiatives could be going on that you would be able to leverage within your group? And Claire had mentioned, you heard her say it's not a one and done, and it absolutely is not. And I think that would be something to expectation set if you brought this back to your department or your division, because someone might be checking the box like, oh good, we're gonna just do that microaggression session and then we're done. As you can see, what even just going through this one session, I can see from our the department we created here today, there's a lot of work to do, and it's not going to happen in one session. And you've got to be, willing and able, and the leader needs to know, your big leader needs to know that this is going to require time and effort from you. And very importantly, who are your collaborators? And think inside and outside of your department or your division. Our collaborators for us have been individuals from our diversity and inclusion team at the medical school, our talent and development team at the medical school. So just leave some time for you to reflect, and if you would like to share anything in the chat, we would love to see that. So our next step was to bring the data that Claire showed you with the numbers and with the qualitative responses back to our leadership team for review. And there are people with varying opinions and observations on the leadership team. So it was a very robust discussion, which was great. Again, our leadership team feels like it has a safe place to disagree, to discuss options and next steps. And in the end, there was an agreement to pursue leadership development opportunities so that all of our mid-level leaders would be have the skills to coach and to learn the skills themselves to reduce, prevent, or address microaggressions on their teams. And the question really became, how can we be more inclusive leaders? And inclusive leadership, there are many books and articles, and there are also, it's an initiative at our medical school, which is really helpful. And I think that this publication really gives the definitions that they provide were very thought-provoking for me. So an inclusive leader is collaborative and facilitative, and as opposed to command and control. And in some organizations, command and control leadership styles have been seen as the norm for a long time. So perhaps a faculty member who's been a leader for a long time may have that leadership style and may need to adapt or at least learn tactics to develop a collaborative and facilitative leadership style. Transparency is something that all of our faculty ask for. And I think for leaders, that's really tough, right? Because there are things that you can't always say. If you are the program director, there's a lot you can't tell people because there's a lot of confidentiality there. But being transparent about the work you're doing, about the goals you want to achieve, about maybe when you can share information is so much more seen as so much more acceptable than just behind a closed door and not sharing. And inclusive leaders, culturally agile, they're willing to look at things from other perspectives, not just their own. And they're able to create a safe space for discussion, disagreement, and solutions to occur. And in the end, they're willing to embrace and leverage diversity. And I think one of the questions that I always think is important to ask is who is not at the table for a decision or on a committee or for a meeting. So that is, those are really some of, at least for this publication, what could define an inclusive leader. So our next step was to collaborate with our institution-based experts, and Dr. Alverno Devine is from the MCW Talent and Development Team, but he is a longstanding diversity and inclusion campus leader. He also has his doctorate of divinity and has gained so much, he has so much skill and experience, and he's gained so much trust within our institution. We feel very fortunate that we are able to have him as an expert and a collaborator. Alverno did help facilitate the meeting that Claire brought you through. He was a key person, and not only as a facilitator, but he helped make sure that as we were creating this programming, that it was going to be helpful to everyone. So we decided to, so if we look at when we had the facilitated meeting that was in September, we brought this leadership, the data to our leadership in November. And in December, Dr. Devine led us through an exercise using the book multipliers. And there are some self-testing that he has access to that all of our faculty leaders were able to take. And the main takeaway from this exercise was identifying your leadership style and seeing how your leadership style may shut some people down or may not move your team forward. And I thought it was a fantastic exercise, and I learned a lot from it. Because this is new and this whole concept and process is new, it's really important to check in with your learners. I have to point out that Dr. Martin is allowing us to take anywhere from 15 minutes to a half hour of a 90-minute leadership meeting to do some of these exercises. So it's really important to get this right. So in real time with the QR code that was created, we asked two questions. Number one, what do our leaders think about this opportunity of working with Dr. Devine on these faculty development opportunities? And most people said yes, which was really great news. Right before taking this survey, Alverno went through important concepts related to inclusive leadership competencies. And so when we gave this survey, we said, so how does everyone want to move forward? And only one person wanted to continue with learning with multipliers. The majority of our leadership team wanted quarterly topics related to inclusive leadership competency development. And they also had a strong interest in case-based discussion. And to me, it's akin to a patient safety conference where we would bring a microaggression event. We would perhaps give people the case before the leadership meeting, ask them how they would handle it, and come back into discussion with Alverno facilitating. And so we're really excited to begin that process. And this lone person who said other, self-identified, and this is really a great example of who's at the table and who's not at the table. This is our system nurse leader who comes to our leadership meetings. And he asked the question, how are we going to engage our emergency department nurses? And I thought that was absolutely fantastic. Also another example of how this work is never one and done. You're always going to discover new ways to impact your environment. So we're really lucky that our institution has an initiative called Inclusive Leadership. And this is from our MCW Diversity and Inclusion Office. And this is what really spoke to me, to be inclusive leaders at all levels. And this is where Alverno is going to take our leadership team. We first started with a self-assessment, and this is a book by Jennifer Brown, which is a fantastic book. called Inclusive Leadership, and it's really worthwhile reading or listening to. It's a pretty quick read if you have any interest in the area. But in real time, our faculty leaders were given these definitions, and they were asked to identify where they were on this spectrum. And the interesting thing about this spectrum, and that Alverno brought to our attention, is that it's ongoing, right? You may be an advocate in one area, and yet, believe me, you're unaware of another area that you need to learn about. And so you're really kind of going back and forth on this inclusive leader spectrum. And what Alverno says, it's not a destination, it's a journey. And we were really excited to see our leadership team all ending up on aware. So aware meaning that they know they have a role to play and they're ready to learn. So Alverno introduced us to these inclusive leadership competencies. And I'm going to just show a couple of examples. I love this one because it groups the competencies necessary for 3 important areas. And I see this as a way to have a discussion with a faculty member about where they feel strong and where they would like some more support and development. This is another wonderful graphic that Alverno also introduced me to. And this is actually from the Minority Corporate Counsel Association. This is from the legal profession. And this is how they've created an inclusive leadership model to include both the intrapersonal dimensions, the interpersonal dimensions, and what those competencies are and how you can achieve them. And then there's one more inclusive leadership that has both traits and competencies. And I was really pleased to see the trait of flexibility. I think emergency physicians tolerate high levels of ambiguity and are highly adaptable, meaning that we as leaders, no matter if we're formal leaders or informal leaders, really can develop the necessary competencies to be inclusive leaders. This is another slide Alverno shared, and this is from other areas outside of medicine. But I think any department chair or leader would love to see these outcomes: positive working relationship, retention of talent, and this leader makes me feel like I can be successful. So this is how we're moving forward. The next 2 are identifying measurable outcomes. We're not there yet. I think that these are really important. Our hospital has, our medical school has a way that they ask you to identify goals, and they've asked leaders to identify inclusive leadership goals. So that's becoming more and more on everyone's radar. And in our department, we are pursuing longitudinal leadership learning opportunities. Dr. Martin has been so pleased with Alverno's work and leadership in this area that he has asked Alverno and myself, and I've asked Claire I've invited Claire to facilitate a session for our faculty. I think when we finally have all of our faculty here in December and January, more of a 2 or 3 hour deep dive on these inclusive leadership competencies and skills. So what are some other next steps? And these are from the literature that you could take, or that I would love to take for our leadership teams. This is what we're doing. A couple of other takeaway actions for leaders that I found frequently in the literature was, we hear mentorship a lot, and I think we can maybe not really dive into what that could mean for somebody. But I think particularly if you're a senior faculty leader and you're you're trying to create a leadership team that might be more representative of our medical students or of our patients, how would you do that? Well, you would identify someone early. You would invite someone. If a leadership team looks one way, someone who doesn't look like that leadership team may not feel or think they would belong. and really identifying someone that might want to be a leader, helping them develop opportunities and skills so that their CV looks like they want to be a leader is critical. And as a mentor, I'm a firm believer in reverse mentoring. When I showed this to our faculty for the first time, I asked them who they thought the mentor was in this picture, and everyone thought that the more experienced looking woman was the mentor. Actually, both people are mentors. And so if you're a experienced leader or more long-standing leader, reach out to your newer colleagues for that. There's benefits gained everywhere. Another really important thing for a leadership team to know is that this is not one group's job. This is everyone's job. And there are many benefits to bringing everyone to the discussion and giving everyone an opportunity to participate. Number one, there's a lot of work to do, and more hands just makes that work go faster. But also, it allows all of the individuals to appreciate the value of diverse initiatives. And just like I said, our department is, all the physicians in our department are benefiting from what initially was seen to be as only something for women, which was family leave. A few other takeaways from the literature. I saw an article about an online faculty development module, and I'm someone who thinks online modules are great as part of that would prep you for an in-person live session, maybe to skill practice. Another really innovative article came from a group in our city. Dr. Deborah Simpson has wonderful faculty development articles, and they implemented an anti-racism training for their family medicine residency with the YMCA during a pandemic, and it was all remote. So, and then the other excellent suggestion is providing counter space. And that is sort of creating a network of safety that maybe identifies safe individuals that individuals in your department or in your organization could go to discuss and debrief about microaggressions. We have something similar in our hospital, piloted by one of our emergency physicians, Dr. Alicia Pilarski. For patient safety events. I mean, if there was a bad patient safety event and you as a physician are, concerned or want to debrief with someone, there are trained people that you can debrief with. I could see something very similar in our organization, or maybe in your organization as well. So I want to thank you for your time and attention. This is a QR code with all of the resources that I evaluated while I was preparing for this presentation. I'll give you a minute if you're going to download those, and if you missed the QR code, we're happy to send that to you at another time. I want to thank you, first of all, to Kim Lohman for her feedback and incredible technical support to get all of this done. If you have any questions or comments, please, we have a few minutes. We can leave them in the chat. And I have Alverno has said he would love to hear from people, and he's a fantastic resource. So feel free to reach out to him. And there's my email as well. And just want to see if anyone has any questions or comments. And one question I came up with that while I was listening to everyone is, what do you see as necessary from leaders in your organization to move forward? What role do you think leaders play? Okay, lead by example. Excellent, excellent. And to me, a little of that comes back to the accountability, and with humbleness and awareness. Absolutely. Does anyone have any opinions about the inclusive leadership model? Thank you. Authentic leadership. Absolutely. Absolutely. Sometimes the first step is the hardest, and that willingness to start to have the difficult conversations and to look to see how you're either contributing or how you're not moving issues forward. Thank you, everyone. I'm going to turn the floor over now to Dr. Elisa Hayes and Jeff Stone to continue our session with some wonderful interactive learner examples. And without further ado, Dr. Hayes and Dr. Stone. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Mary Beth. That was great. I think Dr. Stone is going to take us back to some of the content we talked about at the beginning now, talking about what we can do to reduce microaggressions. We just had an excellent talk on some of the systemic and leadership roles, ways we can tackle this issue, and now we'll talk about some more ways.
Great. Yeah, so back to the model that we're sort of using here to think about how to reduce microaggressions. We just had two great presentations on thinking about how to come at this from the top down, from the leadership, from the institutional level down. We want to finish the session today by talking about solutions to microaggressions from the bottom up, or in other words, how individuals can be empowered to address microaggressions. And a lot of the comments we've seen actually in the last two sessions have really been hitting on this. How do you have those conversations? I'm going to go ahead and give you a quick overview of what we think about with respect to one particular way that individuals can take control of it. And then I'm going to turn it over to Elisa to kind of run through some of her thinking about these issues, as well as take us into some of the exercises we wanted to do. One of the things that I think we want to provide for the people that we work with, if we want to take control of these, is empowering them to confront when microaggressions occur. The thing I know from the research in psychology is that confrontation can be an effective strategy for addressing microaggressions and leading people to start to change and realize that they need to change up their game and do something different when they interact. But it's also risky. And I think that that's the one message I want to make sure that comes across today, is that confrontation can be effective, but we have to pay attention to sort of how we're doing it. Otherwise, it can actually make things worse. And we want to make sure that we're not doing that as we're trying to address these when they occur. One of the things that I think happens a lot of times in situations where microaggressions are occurring is people will wonder, hey, did I just hear what I think I heard, right? Did you just say what I think you said? What that's implying is that, like many helping situations, microaggressions can be ambiguous. And sometimes it takes a minute to kind of think through, what did I just see? Is this really a microaggression? Did I misunderstand what happened? So that's kind of the first step in trying to figure out, is this something I need to respond to? Is working through the ambiguity sometimes. Sometimes it's crystal clear. There's no ambiguity at all. The next step, I think, in that process to think about how to respond has to do with, is this something I need to address? Maybe I don't need to address this at this time. Maybe I don't need to address it at all. But if the decision is, well, this is something that needs to be addressed, the immediate question is always, is this something I need to address right here, right now? Or is this better left for another time? And that's an important decision to make. And I think some of the comments we saw in the earlier sessions seem to be hinting at this being an important consideration when it comes to addressing microaggressions. One of the things that I know comes up in these situations is sometimes it occurs in a social setting where there's other people around, there's going to be other witnesses around, or maybe the person doing the microaggressing is doing it in a way where they think they're making connections with some people at the expense of someone else. And those are situations where, well, you could address it right then, right there, but what you're going to do is potentially put that person in a position to have to save face in front of other people. And you may not get as far as you think you're going to get under those circumstances with that person, right? Because they're going to be actively defending themselves. And so that may be a situation where you think, you know what, I'm going to let it go for now, but we are definitely going to have that conversation later, right? So there's times when, yeah, it's good to address it right now. I think we're going to see some examples of that in just a minute. And other times when maybe you want to grab that person at another time and have that conversation in private. So there's that consideration, and part of what obviously I'm talking about is, thinking through the effectiveness of addressing it and confronting somebody about their bias, calling them out. And, the reason that you wouldn't want to do it in front of other people sometimes is because of, this first point, that people become very, very defensive. And, I think what the literature in psychology says is that virtually nobody thinks that they're racist. Virtually nobody thinks they're sexist, right? Even when they're microaggressing all the time, they would still never self-identify as somebody who's racist or sexist. Some of that's changed, lately. But for the most part, when people are being called out, their first response is to be defensive about it, right? And you could think of it as it's actually a situation where if you're calling somebody out about a racist or a sexist remark, you are putting them into a state of stereotype threat, right? You are implying to them that they fit the stereotype of a racist or a sexist individual. And so everything we talked about with stereotype threat, there's studies showing that, white males can suffer stereotype threat about the stereotype that white males are prejudiced, right? So that alone suggests that, what we have to do is we have to realize that if we're gonna confront somebody about bias, we're potentially going to start off by putting them in a defensive mode. Not the best for learning, right? As we've already talked about. So there's a couple of things we have to do to diffuse that defensiveness, to kind of reduce that defensiveness so that they're a little more open to the idea that maybe they just did something that was racist or sexist, or in some other way biased. And one of the things I think that the research would suggest is that we want to focus on the behavior, not on the person. The reason that's such an important distinction is that when you point out that somebody's done something wrong, that typically leads to an emotional response such as guilt. And when people feel guilty about something they've done, they're more likely to want to make amends. They're gonna want to fix what they've done if given the opportunity, right? And so if we focus on the behavior, we're more likely to elicit an emotional response that can facilitate behavior change. If we focus on the person, what we're more likely to do is elicit the response of shame. Somebody feels like a bad person. And that's typically not an emotional state that motivates change, that motivates withdrawal. And we really don't want people to withdraw in this circumstance. We want them to, as some of the comments said, we want people to become aware of the mistake they've made, of the biases that they have, so that they'll work on changing them, right? We want to motivate change. So focusing on the behavior as opposed to the person is key. And then the other strategy that works really well, that's not always possible in every circumstance, but we've done research in the paper that we published on this is going to be available at the end here, showing that if you can take people through what's often referred to as the compliment sandwich, where you start by saying something positive about them, you can actually, by saying something complimentary to them, put them in a more open-minded state to where they're more likely to accept something negative, right? So you say something like, hey, you really do a great job around here, but there's one thing we really need to talk about. And that pointing out that they do a really great job around there, and especially if you can engage them in talking about the great job they're doing, right? That puts people in this self-affirmed state of mind that opens them up to the possibility that, okay, we can talk about something that's not so positive, and that's okay. It's sort of like a buffer. It creates a buffer. So the compliment sandwich, if you can lead off the conversation with a way of saying, hey, you're pretty important to us. You're doing a good job for us. can put them in the state of mind to say, okay, and now we have to talk about, that statement you made, that comment you made to somebody, that comment you made to me, and we can take them through the rest of what I'm about to talk about with that process. Some of the comments we saw earlier, and I think in particular when Claire was working with everybody on the exercises, had a lot of what I'm about to talk about in it. When it comes to addressing and confronting people about their biases and the microaggressions that they might say, we can start by asking about their intent. What did you mean by that? And getting them to sort of go through that process. Oh, I said this. What did I mean by that? Because again, people are not aware of what they're oftentimes when they're listening or expressing microaggressions. Their intent might be misguided a lot of times. I think sometimes these things happen because people are trying to be funny. They think they're being funny. And so their intent is directed toward that, and making them realize that that intent was misguided. We can address the impact. We need to address the impact and be clear with them about the consequences. So, what harm did they cause? What did that make you feel like? What did that make the person who was the target of the microaggression feel like? So that they're aware that, yeah, you thought you were being funny, but here's the actual consequence that it had. And then I think it's important to counter argue the assertion. And by that, I mean, oftentimes when people are expressing microaggressions, what they're expressing are stereotypes that they have, or beliefs about racism, for example, or sexism. And we want to make sure that they understand that that's inaccurate. And there's a number of ways that we can do that. We can challenge it directly. One of the strategies that works really well, and this comes right out of the implicit bias literature, it's one of the most effective strategies we have for reducing implicit bias, is to point out how the opposite is true of that person, or the opposite is true of that person's group. So providing counter stereotypic examples. So they say, oh, look at the color of your skin, you should be able to speak Spanish. To point out, hey, not everybody with my skin color speaks Spanish, right? And the effect that that has is it makes the stereotypes that they're relying on for the microaggressions less useful. They're no longer applicable, right? Other strategies that work really well for shutting down implicit bias include drawing attention to what the person who's expressing microaggressions shares in common with the person that they're microaggressing against. Because the minute that they see that they have things in common, that takes them from being an out-group member who I can disparage to being an in-group member, and in-group members get a lot of benefits, right? And so flipping sort of the way somebody's categorized through a common identity, pointing out some common shared interests or activities or memberships in groups. And then the final one, and this kind of comes back to the consequence, but helping them take the perspective, gain the perspective really of the person that they're microaggressing against. Having them sit in the shoes, experience what that person is experiencing or what that person's group is experiencing is another way that shuts down, makes it hard to activate and act on those implicit stereotypes and prejudices. So, I think thinking about the defensiveness first, I don't want to, if I make this person respond defensively, I'm not going to have any effect in confronting them, right? And then sort of walking through, the intent, the consequences, and counter-arguing the assertion. I think these are some of the ways that, we can become more effective in confronting others about their microaggressions. And these are the kinds of things and exercises we can sort of lead people through to help them, become more empowered in doing this. Okay, so what we thought we'd do next, I'm going to hand it off to Elisa, and she's going to walk you through some of the thoughts that she has about these processes. I'm going to stop my share. We're going to play with all of this that we just talked about here in just a minute.
Perfect, thanks. Let me get my screen shared here. And then start.
I just noticed there's a comment from Anastasia, and it's a good one. I mean, sometimes people are aware of what they're saying and do intend to cause harm. No, yeah, absolutely. And those are the macroaggressions that we talked about at the start that, we definitely want to address those. And all the things we just talked about, I think still apply with respect to their defensiveness. Yeah. go ahead. Sorry.
Oh, no, that's great. Yeah, thanks for those comments. So, yeah, so as I mentioned, I'm a residency program director, and I've been involved in medical education. And so for me, this topic is, I'm in a unique position, and I think many of us who are part of this organization are. So it's not only about how these experiences of microaggressions affect ourselves and how we deal with them ourselves, but also how we teach others to deal with them, and how we react as role models and leaders for other people. So I know that many of you, are at different levels in your, your own departments, everything from students to, retired faculty members, but really no matter what level you're at, you are seen as a leader by someone. And having this knowledge really, it's great to have the knowledge, but we have to continue to practice. Like, this is really hard stuff, with the cognitive loads and the fatigue that we deal with in emergency medicine, and how ripe with microaggressions our clinical environment is. I think this is something that we need to consistently work on, and continue to do our best to make emergency medicine as a specialty a better place for our learners, and to improve the health of our patients, as well as our workforce. So, this isn't something that we typically talk about in the curriculum of emergency medicine. I don't think, we talk about communication and professionalism, but, we experience microaggressions in so many forms, especially in the ED. There's physicians, experiencing or committing microaggressions towards their patients, attendings to trainees, between colleagues, among interprofessional teams, and then by the patients against the physicians. So there are just so many ways in which microaggressions can be harmful to the patient and physician's health, and really puts quality at risk. So remembering that we need to kind of go beyond what our usual curriculum is in dealing with this topic. I did want to mention briefly this concept of professional identity formation, and I'll show you a little rubric around that, and how I think that microaggressions may play a significant role in how people become physicians, especially in our specialty. And then, like I said, we'll get to some of those scenarios. So as many of you already know, the majority of students and residents experience harassment or discrimination during their training. And important to remember that, although they do experience this from many different areas, that we as faculty members are still the main source of much of this mistreatment. And so keeping in mind, even for, those of us who want to pay attention to this, that inadvertently we may be perpetrating this. So and a word about specifically emergency medicine. Looking at, just by the numbers, we know that medical students are now majority women. It's like 50.5% women who go into emergency medicine. But you quickly see those numbers declining as far as the numbers of women who stay, who choose emergency medicine as a specialty in residency, and then the numbers who stay as active physicians over the course of time. This same, situation plays out when you look at underrepresented minorities in medicine as well. You see much lower numbers than what we would expect based on the general population, or the demographics of students who are graduating from schools right now. So it's important to emphasize that microaggressions aren't simply about having hurt feelings. Rather, it's this repeated, experience of being invalidated, alienated, or dismissed that can have both biological and social level consequences. So so many medical schools have gone to a model of professional identity formation, and this was proposed by the Carnegie Foundation back in 2010. And basically this model suggests that you journey through school as, from a layperson to someone who becomes a skilled physician, and that this journey is partially influenced by who you were when you started. So, your race or gender, your, background as far as your upbringing, but then you're socialized into this, community of academic medicine or just medicine in general. And that this is where we really can see a lot of impacts from microaggressions that, especially early on in the career, these experiences can influence who you think you are as a physician, and really affect your ability to perform. So these are this slide explains some of the factors that are in play when you think about being socialized into the role of a physician. And so although, role models and mentors are very important, those things that we do consciously, there are a lot of unconscious things and things that are witnessed that play into and impact who the students or residents grow into and become. So, if an individual doesn't feel comfortable in these new roles or is perceived as lacking important capabilities, this professional identity formation can be compromised. So we'll work today to, prepare ourselves to respond to some microaggressions or other mistreatment before it occurs. And thank you to Dr. Stone for sharing with us his strategies for confrontation. And I think we'll share a document in the chat so that you can, one, take this with you, to your own institutions, but to reference it as we walk through a few scenarios. And these scenarios are based on my personal experiences. So, these are just examples, but I gave these examples because I wanted to illustrate how it's not only, as I mentioned, how we're acting or reacting to what our own feelings are, but also considering how we're role modeling or how we're teaching others to react in these situations as well. So the first scenario I'll start with is a shift where you're working in the emergency department, where you're shadowing where you have a shadowing medical student. In your emergency department, there's also residents, lots of different sorts of learners around. This first scenario starts with myself sitting at a computer. That's typically where the attending physician sits. But a technician is coming and looking for the supervising faculty member to sign an EKG. And they ask you and the medical student who's sitting there, do you know where the attending is? And you reply, yeah, that's me. I'm the attending. And this tech says, you go, girl, and hands you the EKG. And you're like looking at the EKG and thinking, that's weird. Why did she just say you go, girl? Like, is she really excited about me reading this EKG? Like, I'm going to be really good at that or something. And so I'll start off the conversation by using one of the strategies already, which is to ask what the intent was. So I said, why did you say that? Why did you say you go, girl? And her response to me was, well, I just started working here and I really haven't seen a lot of women who are, the doctors here. So I was just saying, like, you go, that's awesome. Like, you went to med school, that's really hard and stuff. And, you're working here. This is a really busy place. Like, like, congrats, like, for getting this far, I guess. And I didn't know what to say and just started trying to think about how to figure out if there was anything concerning going on the EKG. But instead of paying attention to the EKG, I was starting to think about oh gosh, like I feel like I should say something to the student about what just happened, and also maybe to the tech, so this doesn't happen again. And I did say some things, but I would like maybe the group to use some of these strategies and suggest what one might do in this situation.
I put the document in the chat, so you can look at sort of the slide that we had up before.
Well, and I guess the first question, maybe even for the students, would be interesting. Like, would you see this as a microaggression, right? Like, is this a microaggression?
I think it is a microaggression in some ways, and this is something that I experience very regularly. Just being a medical student, and people are always congratulating me for being a medical student. It's just a little awkward.
Can I ask what makes it awkward, do you think?
It's awkward in the sense that, of course, it's something to be proud of to have reached this point of getting a medical student, but I don't want it to be so surprising, if that makes sense, that someone can reach that level. Whereas if I had said perhaps, oh, I'm in school to be something, maybe a nurse of some sort, maybe that I wouldn't have received that kind of a excited reaction of some sort. Or it's just things that I think about.
Yeah, that when I was thinking that it's ambiguous as to what they're implying, and it makes you stop and have to think, wait a minute, are you suggesting I'm not supposed to be doing this? And
exactly.
Yeah, that's part of the ambiguity that characterizes these situations. That moment you have to work through, what the heck is that supposed to mean? And yeah, so it is a microaggression, and the first response that Lisa said is to ask, wait a minute, what did you mean by that? Right? So question the intent. And you feel like in this situation, you want to try to say something to help this person understand the impact, and that maybe, you need to think before you say those kinds of comments. Is there a way to address the impact? Would it make sense to address the impact?
I think in the moment, I typically just say thank you so much, and I kind of try to refocus my purpose in being in the room with the patient. But it's just an unusual feeling to be constantly congratulated for being in medicine, and when you just barely have your training wheels on.
In this case, I said to the tech, which I don't know if this is the right thing to say, or I'll tell you what I said and then you can critique it, see if I should have said something better. I said, oh, you must be new because I haven't met you before, but also you must not have worked a lot of shifts here, because there actually are a lot of women faculty members in our department. So you must just not have had a chance to meet many of them yet. And also in medical school, there's more women in medical school now than men, right? And she didn't say anything back to me, but but I told her that, like, yeah.
Rebecca's comment in the chat. Yeah, it's wild these days. Women are doing all kinds of things.
Yeah, I just say that in a joking way and kind of disarming, but I don't know.
Does it feel like sometimes using humor, sort of both diffuses the situation, but also makes the point.
And then the other thing I said in this situation was I pointed out to the student, and I didn't necessarily point out to the tech because by this time she had walked off, but I said, I'm supposed to be reading this EKG right now, but actually I'm sitting here thinking about what I should say in this situation. So I have to like cognitively try harder to do this than I should have. Like, I should have just been handed the EKG and been able to do this without having to think about what I need to say to you and to her and to correct that. So, but I guess like just pointing that out was something that like I've started to try to do that more so people understand like I'm distracted right now because of what just happened.
Yeah, that's one of the characteristics of stereotype threat. It divides your attention, right? That's the state of stereotype threat is I'm doing this thing I'm, been trained to do that I'm really good at. Oh, wait, now I have this other thing I have to be thinking about, right? And, the confrontation, to be able to confront it, to be able to address it, to be able to sort of, make this person aware of the impact so that they can, hopefully change. That's going to now take cognitive resources and emotional resources away from reading the EKG or whatever you're doing with a patient, for example. And so that's the decision I think a lot of times people have to make about, do I do this now? I'm in the middle of doing something, versus maybe I need to come back and talk to this tech at another time. And there could be good reasons to maybe wait.
Dr. Hayes, this is Monica. That was really helpful. Oh, sorry, are we going on or can I?
No, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. That's really helpful because as a junior learner, I certainly, during residency and even now as a fellow, I certainly see those situations and see how people with more experience deal with them. Can you talk just a little bit about what you tell the medical student or what you tell kind of the resident who witnesses this and how they should, kind of move forward knowing that they will probably experience this? Because I think that's the piece and I think others sometimes struggle with is like, what message are we sending out there? What are we putting out there to future doctors?
Yeah, I don't like in this scenario, I left it at that. Like I didn't go back to the student and say anything else, but I think about like what else could I have said? Sometimes I will, for students who, for example, for a student who I know like doesn't see it, I will talk about it like outside the room. I think there's another example I have here where I'm pretty sure that the student didn't see what just happened as a microaggression, but I'm feeling, stressed or distracted by it. And sometimes I'll try to take the time to explain it, especially, like in the example Dr. Phelan gave of like, you're a person who's not ever been in a wheelchair before, so you don't see it that way. I just tried to, help them see it, and describe like how it distracts me. And I've had, especially like when I know it's about to happen, like I'm like, I'm gonna go in this room and I know this patient's gonna think I'm the nurse. So watch this. Like this is what's about to happen.
Right.
And here's what we're gonna do.
Right.
And I think that's helpful, but it's not like a solution to like, it didn't stop it from happening, and it didn't stop like, I don't know. Maybe Dr. Stone has better solution.
No, that's helpful. Thank you. I think what people are saying in the chat too, just even naming it and acknowledging it to someone who's more junior really will help them going forward. It will make them feel safe and psychologically supported in these matters.
Awesome. Okay, so let's do one more scenario. So this one's kind of got a lot of layers to it. So this one is you walk into the next room. You're accompanied by the student who's shadowing. The patient's on the phone talking about, hey, I'm in the ER, I'm having chest pain, and they put their hand over the phone. Hold on, my nurse is here. So you introduce yourself then as the attending physician. And I don't know about you all, but for me, this like a lot of the cues that people use to identify who is in the room or who people are have gone away because of COVID, because everyone is, wearing scrubs and masks and eye protection. And other than maybe our name badges, there's really not a lot of like cues, based on what you're wearing or things like that. So it's become even like more of a problem in the pandemic times. I was once standing at the airway of a trauma patient and no one in the room even recognized that I was a physician that I was about to intubate because I was new. And so it's like, and I'm sure it was because I had all the PPE on and no one knew who I was, but so the patient indicates to the family member on the phone, I'll call you back. You introduce yourself, state your roles. The patient winks at the student and says kind of in a suggestive tone, like, well, you can examine me anytime. Unsure of what to say, you both just kind of smile uncomfortably and go about doing the rest of the history and physical. And you notice that the student really omitted several key questions while taking the history. And outside the room later, you kind of inform her about what she missed as far as asking those questions, but wonder if maybe the patient's comments had made her uncomfortable and unable to, perform to her best level. You go back to the desk, and about an hour later, the nurse comes to you again, stating the patient would like an update. They're really frustrated because the doctor has not been in to see them yet. So, lots of opportunities to say things here. Any suggestions where you would start? This is one that I find especially challenging because I think that the microaggressions that come from patients, especially in the setting of the emergency department where we, don't have an established relationship with people, makes them especially hard to address without losing that what small amount of trust they might have had in you without knowing anything about you. And this is where I hear Dr. Stone echoing in my ears when I don't say anything, because I think about, well, I think it would do more damage to say something now than it would help.
Is there, with respect to the perception of you as the nurse, is that an inaccuracy that needs to get clarified to provide adequate care? Make a case that this is one that, really needs to get addressed so that the patient, will do what we need them to do. Because if they think, well, you're just the nurse, I'll wait for the doctor. Seems like they're not gonna, follow your advice or provide information you need.
Yeah, for me, it does sometimes cause problems. I've actually even had like formal patient complaints lodged against me because they've said like I never saw the doctor. The only person who saw me was you. Like they fully know it was me who saw them. They just don't understand that I'm the doctor, even when, I state my name, what my role is. Before COVID, I wore a white coat. Like I'm doing the things a doctor does, saying the stuff a doctor does. Like it's just it's really hard for some people to move past that vision of like, doctors are whatever. Most people think they're older white men, but.
Vicken I don't know if you can see the chat, Vicken has a comment, says, I would have said, I am your doctor. You've been seen by both an attending physician and by a medical student. What is it you are having a problem with? It's pretty direct. Let me correct the assertion, right? Does that seem, I guess I'm curious, Vicken, when you have had to do that, what's the response from the patient? Do they say, oh, sorry?
Usually they do say, oh, sorry, especially when, now that I've got gray hairs, I get a whole lot less than I used to when I was a young woman. Also, there's a whole lot more women doctors now. When I started out, there were only about 10% of all physicians were women, and even fewer in emergency medicine. But usually they just get real embarrassed and kind of back off. Once in a great while, I've maybe 2 or 3 times in my career, I've had some truly inappropriate suggestions. And at least once, when I was pregnant intern in my 20s, 3 other patients who were sitting within earshot, it was an open bed ward, 36 bed open ward. 3 other patients stood up, threw open the curtain, and confronted the patient about his inappropriate behavior. She's your doctor and you will treat her with respect. They were all elderly gentlemen wearing VA gowns, but I guess seeing the 3 codgers was enough to cow that patient. That's been my
nice. Support. Yeah, that just strikes me as an important one to directly address. The other one that's a little more challenging is the statement toward the student, right?
Mm-hmm.
And that it strikes me that's an interesting one because might be able to address the patient in a way that would change that behavior in the future, or at least with that patient, with that student. But you worry about the harm that's been caused for the student, right? And maybe that's a good example of where the conversation you need to really have with the student about how do you deal with those kinds of reactions from patients? May happen again. I don't know. Curious about your thoughts on that.
Well, as a faculty member, when someone makes a suggestive comment, my first sort of layer is, does the person actually know what they're doing? If the person's super intoxicated or demented, it's a different conversation with the patient and with the student, and it's a safety issue. You sometimes bring a male counterpart in, or more than 1 or 2 people in the room, because that person, in addition to not knowing what they're doing, may actually be so disinhibited they could hurt you or do something. But if the person is, doing that on purpose, it's hey, you're crossing a line. We don't do that. We're here to make sure that your heart attack is getting taken care of. Tell me about what's going on, and just being very, very direct. Then I do counsel the students afterwards in terms of, I step out and go, so what did you think? Has this ever happened to you before? It shouldn't happen. There are, if you're in our ER, you can go to any nurse, any physician, and they will, provide support for you, because, we're all, connected. So the first thing has to really be, and then explaining to the student, if the patient is demented or intoxicated, you have to be aware for your own safety if that's happening.
So I'm getting a weird message on my Zoom right now that's telling me my internet is unstable. So I'm gonna fast forward to there was a couple more examples there, which you can feel free to use or discuss if you would like. But I think what Dr. Phelan just shared was a good example of kind of how it can be important afterwards to debrief or reflect on these experiences, but that ignoring them, minimizing them or just laughing it off it is not the appropriate response, and that oftentimes, we have to hold our patients to a higher standard of behavior. And there are some institutions that have very good examples of policies. I think the Mayo Clinic is one that you can share, with your institution to see if they would be interested in something like that. Of course, in emergency medicine, we can't, turn people away or things like that, but we can, at least get some language or institutional support for, holding our patients to a standard of respect whenever possible. So I guess I'll end here by just, kind of reiterating what we did here today. Just I hope that you all learned something in regards to I know I do every time I hear this stuff, learn new things, especially about how my work is affected by stereotype threat and how important it is to continue the work that we do in regards to addressing microaggressions in academic emergency medicine. In these tools that we've provided you with, you can bring back to your own organizations to engage with your own leaders, approach your own learners, and work on this in your own departments. So all of the presenters today are happy to hear from you, your feedback, your proposals for future collaborations, your interest in talking or hearing any more from us or other members of the workshop today. You're invited to do that. And I just want to say very special thanks to Dr. Stone and to Claire Becker for joining us today. We really appreciate your expertise, and I think you all have amazing skills and knowledge and are experts in these areas. I'm thankful that you can join us at SAM today.
I wanted to share some resources before we finish. Could I put up a slide real quick that people can, and it'll be in the recording, and I forgot to do it.
Oh yeah, there you go.
Let's do this real fast.
And while Jeff is sharing that slide real quickly, recording is available on Juno until October 31st and on SAEM.org. So if you missed parts or want to repeat them or just listen to all this knowledge again, you can go online and get this recording.
So I have a QRP here for the all the references that I had in my presentations. And then I provided three files that I think you'll find interesting. One is a great paper by Diane Burgess on stereotype threat for women in academic medicine. And then this Speak Up pamphlet, I guess, from tolerance.org. It's a really great sort of, I guess, source for how to step up and confront microaggressions across a lot of different contexts. So definitely recommend you take a look at that. And then there's a chapter that we wrote recently on how to use confrontation in a healthcare setting as a way to address bias. But there's a number of resources in this first QRP for, if you want to follow up and learn more about stereotype threat, things that you could bring back to teach people about, really good resource.
Jeff, is there any way to put those in the chat? We had one request. I don't know if we can.
Yeah, I can try to do that. Let's see. I mean, the easiest way to do it is just copy and paste this into the channel. It'll let me.
And
it's too much information.
It's too much. Okay. Vic, and I can actually send you the email with the QR codes if that would work. If you want to, I don't know how I can get your email.
It's
if you want to send me a PM, I'm sorry.
First name dot last name at gmail.com. Anybody on the chat is welcome to email me if they want to for any reason. So I can delete lots of things.
So Vicken at Totten?
No, vicken.totten@gmail.com.
Perfect.
Okay. Back on mute.
Or email me directly.
Great. Well, again, thanks to our medical student ambassadors today. You guys did a great job keeping up with all of our chats and keeping the conversation going. We really appreciate it. And to all the folks at SAM, George and Monica for moderating today. Really appreciate you and hope this was useful. Feel free to share this with others at your institutions, and hope to see you again in person, maybe in New Orleans.
Wonderful. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank
Bye.
you.
Bye.
Yeah, Jeff, it's in New Orleans next year, so
I'll be there.
Yeah. and we're going out on Thursday evening to celebrate, so we'll send you a virtual cheers from
Nice.
from Wisconsin.
I'll be jealous. I'll be very
Alberno also said he would be willing to participate, so that would be pretty exciting if we got something going for next year.
I'm sorry, panelists, just really quickly, is there anything else we can help you with before we sign out?
No, we're all good.
Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much.
Thanks,
It's a great
everybody.
session. Appreciate it.
Have a great day, everyone.
You
Enjoy
too.
the
Bye now.
conference. Bye.
Bye.